that means is that there's a statistical expectation that search engines have for the content that they rank. And more recently, I've just been thinking more and more about this with respect to the computer science behind search and what we do, because we're just kind of at this abstraction layer of like, okay, let's make things that rank better. But if you think more about this, it's like, okay, well, we've always just been thinking like, yeah, just make good content, and then we'll optimize it with like metadata, and we'll build links. And so we've really over-indexed on the link building side because that's the thing that we really understand and we can control. If you look at some of the rank factor studies going back a few years, you'll see like the #1 thing that correlated with rankings was like page authority or linking root domains and things like that. But the #2 thing was always something content specific that goes back to IR concepts. So that tells me that this is something that we could effectively solve through text analysis. I completely believe there's a world wherein we write content the way there's adjustments that happen that make it perfectly optimized. I don't know that we necessarily have that, like there isn't a tool for that right now, but I do know that natural language generation has come very far. And I'm not saying just do like content spinning. I'm saying that this content can be reviewed by an NLG algo, and then it says, okay, let's change this word to that, and so on and so forth, until it makes sense, and then also hits those measures for what Google expects. I would encourage you guys to do semantic keyword research, especially the way that Paul. There is, a lot of the companies that we work with that do this have spun it up internally, where they basically variance, and then they do the causal impact study using R. There's no reason you can't do that yourself. Key things to think about: pages that are getting crawled the most. Clients have just been like stuff when we do these variations, because then your test is a false positive or false negative if they haven't recrawled those variants in that time. Another thing is you want to also make sure you're pulling in the right SEO metrics. Search volume and positions and such, you don't know that these are actual positive or negative results. And then automated testing. If you're working in an environment where there's a lot of deployments happening, they're working on an agile model, they're doing what's called continuous deployment or continuous integration, they probably already have workflows set up where they're running automated tests to account for, like, did the logic break, did the front end break, or what have you. If you inject SEO into these, then you won't have to worry about them breaking your stuff that you've already fixed in subsequent deployments. So there's three different types of tests we want to talk about. There's unit tests, there's UI tests, and then there's also functional tests. So unit tests are on a function level. So you write a function that, let's say we return copy for the page. Well, on that function, you can put some checks in place that if it doesn't return this, build test, same thing. That's when you're testing to see that when you bring things together, like let's say you're pulling your data from your APIs or your database and so on, then you can test to make sure that things are working the way that you expect. So in that case, let's say you've got a page that is being generated, and then also what you're doing when you're crawling, that's effectively what UI testing does. But again, you can set up things where you have some checks, and then if these things fail, then you can fail the build, and then things can't roll out unless people are accounting for SEO. So that's what headless Chrome is actually for. Things like Phantom.js. You bored? You okay? Okay. Things like Phantom.js, headless Chrome, and then also Selenium, they are created for this specifically, wherein you can do these types of tests and make sure that things are where you expect them to be. And if you look in the documentation, Google says, like, hey, this is why we made it. So really, this happens when you're doing what's called test-driven development. So a lot of developers just make things, put them out, and then see what happens. But there are also those more professional developers who are like, let's make sure that we're testing each component of this, so as we roll out new things, they don't break. Your role is effectively like that product manager who comes in and says, hey, here are the test cases that we want to run and account for to make sure that things don't break. So here's a couple of examples. One could be just testing for the presence of a meta description. That could be a unit test that's run on the page before it's ultimately returned from the server. It could also be one where you're checking for your internal links as a functional or integration test. So this just talks about like the steps that you would run, also what data you need to use, what the expected results are, what the actual results are, and then what happens when you pass or fail. So some of these things you may want to have fail the entire build, which means that no one can deploy further without fixing it. Some of these things you may not want to. So log file analysis, I completely agree. We absolutely need to be doing this. And if you're not doing log file analysis, you're basically just guessing. So if you're like, oh yeah, it looks like you got penalized, you don't know that. Just because you saw a visibility chart in some tool that says you dropped at the same time as an algorithm update, you don't know that you necessarily got penalized. This is what an algorithm penalty looks like. So typically, what you see is a lot of Googlebot activity. You see an uptick in traffic, and then you see a drop in traffic and also that visibility. And so the reason why I believe this is the way that it's going is because we all know that Google's leveraging machine learning pretty heavily now. And so they're using that dwell time effectively as the response variable for those models that they're building out. We also see that, see more data to reinforce that. So in this case, this client, they saw a huge bounce rate increase at the same time that they lost a ton of traffic. And then they also saw that their main competitor that got all that traffic, their bounce rate stayed pretty consistent or dropped. I want us to be doing way more and being proactive about our understanding of Google. I feel like the SEOs from like 10, 15 years ago, they're very much about testing, digging into their data, figuring out these insights so we can definitively understand how Google works. There's a great post that went up today. I told you I just did this. It went up today on SEL talking about a guy who did some spider traps just to see how Google actually reacts to different types of links. And speaking about links, again, PageRank is the measure. We don't have complete visibility in the PageRank. I mean, the paper has dramatically, or the function has dramatically changed from the original backrub paper. But nevertheless, it's still the measure that Google's using. They're not using any of these other metrics we've made up. And so really having that understanding of that is incredibly important. Dixon Jones, right before he left Majestic, wrote a great post just breaking down how PageRank works. I would encourage you to check that out. But another thing that I learned from just looking through patents and things, and this is the thing that a lot of people already knew from SEO, is that Google is looking at the text around your links. Like we know that. We know that looking in Ahrefs, they provide the text prior to it and then after it, so they leverage that pretty heavily. But they're also looking for parity about the content from both sides. And again, we can build 100,000 links and then you can rank by brute force, or you can build like 5 or 6 that has content parity and it'll work. Internal link building, like Kevin was talking about, incredibly important. We've done tests with clients that have huge sites where we've seen that the sweet spot, and it's not a hard and fast rule, but for a couple of clients, it's about 2,000 links internally built to a given page yields increases in organic search visibility. And then also Botify did some great studies around looking at how internal links impact crawling throughout the site or bot activity. So again, your internal link equity is incredibly important to improving your visibility. And again, I've kind of mentioned this already. Paul has a great post about how you can leverage the iGraph library to compute your internal page rank. Botify does it automatically. Screaming Frog does as well. Here's a model of how you can programmatically develop your internal linking is between pages, and then inject links onto those pages. And there's just so much more for us to know here. I love this post that Searchmetrics put out talking about About.com when they split their sites up and then seeing how well they perform. And there's a post that came out recently from Keyword Hero. The tool's kind of whatever, but this post is great where they're trying to predict where Googlebot will go next. And let's talk a little bit about headless browsers. I've got about a minute left. So you should be using Puppeteer. Puppeteer is great. You can also check out Nick.js. Nick.js will allow you to switch back and forth between Phantom and Chrome. And some things to know about headless Chrome. There are ways, there's a lot of cool things you can do with it. One, you can intercept network requests. So here's an example of, clicking the download button on LinkedIn, and then you can basically save that file however you want. There's a lot of use cases here, but I don't want to tell you black hat things. A lot of things you could do. Also, make sure that you're setting a default language. Make sure that you are setting a custom WebGL vendor and renderer and a default size for broken images, because otherwise you can detect headless Chrome. So wrapping it up, I think really technical SEO is largely about us being curious. You can define it by being, oh, you do this or you do that and so on, fine. But I think it's largely about us being comfortable saying, hey, I want to try this out and figure out how that works for SEO. And then you beat EvaCorp. That's great. So I'm from a company called iPullRank. That's our CEO. That's also our CEO. My name is Mike King. I'm a recovering big agency guy, full stack developer, full stack marketer. We do all these things. We got a guide, Machine Learning for Marketers, that you should check out. And shout out to the Eagles for winning the Super Bowl. And that's all I got. Questions?
Guys, any questions for Mike? You have time for one question.
You guys know all that stuff?
Who's going to get it? All right, here we go. Right, here I come.
There's no question from Jared? I was hoping he was going to troll me in real life.
Don't let me be the only one asking. If other people have questions, I'm happy to turn the mic over. I want to follow up with you about the natural language processing and you believing that that's the future of content creation. Kind of the premise of it that you've stated is that there's a standard set of vocabulary used within any corpus of information, and that if we can understand what that corpus is and the distribution of vocabulary within it, then we can take things that we've written naturally, compare it to what the corpus expects, which is what the search engine expects, and adjust what we've written to match that corpus. Correct?
Yes.
If that's the case, though, don't you end up always creating new content that should have new distributions of the vocabulary potentially and altering them to match the old distributions? Aren't you slowing down the evolution of what would otherwise be the way that the rest of the market is talking about whatever given subject or corpus of information you're working in? Don't you always end up creating content that's compared to a lagging set of indicators as opposed to creating a leading set of indicators?
I mean, don't we do that inherently by doing keyword research first?
That's fair. No, it's 100% accurate. Well done. The broader question maybe that I'm asking is, how do you avoid the pitfalls of automating large pitfalls there? And I worry about advice being given like that as just kind of a blanket, here's a silver bullet, to be looking out for to make sure they're doing it the right way.
Sure. I mean, I still think that, users first. Like, we're talking about technical SEO, so we're talking about the minutia of things, right? Like, I still think you shouldn't be publishing content unless it's awesome. I'm just saying that natural language generation gives us, like, another layer of editing to help us get more towards what search engines expect. But if ultimately, you run it through a tool like that and it's trash, then don't put it out, right? Like, you should still be thinking about, like, what does the brand want to put out there? What are we trying to ultimately say? How are we trying to convey this to people? I look at it like this. Like, we follow this concept that I like to call the poetry of SEO, right? So think about a haiku. Haikus have 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. That's no excuse for it to be trash. It still needs to be elegantly written. It still needs to be something that people want. And despite the fact that I'm talking about, like, yes, there can be a tool that can help us, we still need to be writing things for people. Anything else?
Cool.
No problem.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Mike. All right. So I have good news and bad news. Bad news is that our next presenter is also an Eagles fan, which is tough. Yeah, still a bit of a sore subject after last year. Our next presenter is Frank Vitovich, and last year at Tech Boost, he predicted that the Eagles might win the Super Bowl, and still definitely a sore subject here, but we won't hold it against him. We love Frank. He's near and dear to our hearts at Catalyst. He's part of the All-Star team at Spotify, and he has a great presentation planned for everyone today. So, Frank, join me on stage.
Sweet. Cool. Do I just talk? Is it on?
Yep.
All right, this is on?
Yep.
You guys can hear me? Okay, wow. So I didn't realize there was a table up here I was supposed to be sitting at all day, so this is the first time I'm looking out. There are a lot of people in this room. Did not realize that. But so before I do get started, I want to give props to two people, one of which who was just on the stage here. But one, looking out at all of this, all of the people here, Paul deserves major credit for putting this on. This is his brainchild. This is his baby, and it's phenomenal. The growth from last year to this year is awesome. So props to Paul. And also props. Paul's also the most humble, unassuming person in the world, so that probably really annoyed him that I called him out. Sorry. But also wanted to give props to Megan. Megan did a phenomenal job organizing this as well. She put up with people like me who tried to email her 25 megabyte files on the Amtrak Wi-Fi yesterday after promising to have my deck last week. But she's done it with a smile and is probably the nicest person in the room. So thank you very much. OK, so you have structured data. Now what? All right, let's get through these slides here. What I'm hoping happens from this presentation here today is that it gives you all a few ideas. One of the things I personally don't like of going to conferences is when someone tells you what you should do and says, this is what you have to do to rank on page one. The internet is such a wild place, and websites vary so differently that there is no definite rule in SEO, even though Mike did say we should have standards. But for all of our sakes, we might not want that, because then we might not have jobs very long. So let's hope that that takes a few more years. So anyway, hoping to give you all a few ideas as we go through. Who am I? Also, credit to Paul here. I totally stole this idea from him when I saw him do this 2 years ago. I was going to change it, but because I'm talking about structured data, I thought I had to keep it in. And also, under my skill set, I do have a reference to being a fan of the Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles. It wasn't planned that the Eagles fans went back-to-back, but at least in some form of life, the Eagles will be going back-to-back in something this year. So get that out of the way before it comes flying at me. Anyway, my name is Frank Vitovich. I work at Spotify. Previously, I worked at Catalyst / Group M for about 5 years. So I've been in the SEO space for quite a long time. The guys that work at me, a lot of grief for being pretty old. But anyway, we're here to talk about structured data because we all want SERPs like this, don't we? Full disclosure, this has nothing to do with actual structured data, but it was a search for owner of the New England Patriots right after the Super Bowl, showing Nick Foles as their proud owner. And I had to listen to 5 years of working at Catalyst of the Red Sox and the Patriots. So you know what they say about payback. Anyway, let's get serious. All right, so the reason that I wanted to talk about structured data is because I feel it's a little bit like Ricky Bobby here and not knowing what to do with his hands. I feel like we get it, and then we're like, sweet, that's implemented. What do I do now? So there's a lot that you can actually do with structured data. That's what I'm going to go through here. We have 6 different kind of examples and use cases of ways that we see a lot of our clients using structured data a little bit more strategically, as opposed to just saying it's on my page, great. So we'll go through each of these quickly. You might notice a theme, sticking with the Ricky Bobby references here, but not auditing your structured data at scale is something that I think happens quite a bit. When you get it, you test a product page, a category page, all your different page templates, but you don't normally test them all unless you're crawling kind of your full site and seeing every single one of those, because there can be some needles in the haystack. So also, full disclosure, I work at Spotify. It's the only SEO tool that I use anymore, so all of my examples are from our wonderful software. But these are just some of the types of structured data we actually collect during every crawl that we do. So we have a lot of data that we could sit on to take a look and see how can we use the values that we have in some of these structured data types strategically. So a lot of these examples are actually in a white paper that we just released. There's a link here at the end if you want to download it. It has a few more details of how or what each of these examples entails. But here's an example of an e-commerce client that we were working with, millions of pages on their website. They crawled the entire thing, and what they found after doing so was that 20% of their product and brand pages, which are the two types of page types that they want to have structured data, were either missing it altogether or they had errors in it because they were kind of like minute little errors that were present. So what we were able to do is work with them and kind of isolate what it was. This might be a little tough to see on the screen, but what it shows is that they found that the brand name, for instance, was not getting picked up. So we wanted to figure out why that was, dove into it, found out that there was a bad escape fragment in their JSON LD implementation. It wasn't getting picked up, and that's where the errors were coming from. But little things like that we actually see happen all the time. We had another e-commerce client recently who had like the quotation mark in their product titles because there was an inch length in the product titles. That was breaking it. So there's all these kind of little things that could pop up. So crawling at SEO will help you kind of identify what those needles in the haystack are. All right, so how can we actually use it? Now that we know it's present, we keep track of it, we make sure that it stays there. How can we use it strategically? This I thought was a great example of where a customer of ours, again, it was an e-commerce client. They took their price of their product pages, and then they took a look at the word count that were on each of those pages broken out by these price bands. Then they focused on their really expensive products that had thin content, and then they went out and actually optimized all of those. So if you manage SEO on a large website, I think one of the challenges that we all face is that you have a lot of pages. How do you determine which ones you manually optimize? Using structured data is a great way to get targeted with what you are spending your time on. Another one example here where we had a customer that had a lot of product pages that had a lot of reviews. So these were popular products. They actually had some conflicting signals on them. In Spotify terminology, we call that not compliant. It just means that there's some sort of signal that they were giving the search engines that they actually didn't even want that page indexed in the first place. So again, if you were just looking at kind of one-offs, you would miss things like this. And I think this was a great example of how they were able to use it strategically. Also able to identify opportunities. So I covered off on some e-com examples. Here's some publishing examples. So these next 4 or 5 are all about just different publishing sites. This publisher took the date of the published date of all the articles they had on their website. You can see there's quite a few. And what they wanted to know was, what is the ideal age of the content on our website? At what point do we start to see the most traffic? And what they were able to find out, which is a little bit different than some publishers that we normally see, is that the 6 to 12 month band of articles seem to be generating the most traffic to their website. Newer content wasn't quite generating that much. So what they did was now they took all of the articles in that band, and that could be, again, if you're looking at your site, that could be 9 to 12 months. It could be 1 to 3. Just it really depends on your actual data. But then they compared what are the ones that are getting traffic in that band versus the ones that aren't. How do we get the ones that aren't to look like the ones that are getting traffic? And they did that by looking at things like the depth, how deep into the site it was, how many inlinks those articles had. And now they had their strategic set of pages for them to jump into. Actually, I forgot. This is another e-commerce example. But this was an e-commerce site, sold a lot of different brands. They pulled out the brand name of all of those products and saw, does Google like brands from one company versus another? And then how do we, again, now do we take these and we optimize them further? But also, how do we get those small bars at the end of the chart here to look like the ones in the front? All right, so the next ones are fun because this is my own website. Aside from working at Spotify, I pretend to be a sports writer in my free time. If any of you are customers of ours or have been pitched, you probably saw my website in the demo because it is our demo account. But it's a Notre Dame football website, or I should say the undefeated Notre Dame Fighting Irish. But it's been a good year for sports for me. And what I did with my site was I pulled out the author name. And I wanted to see, because we actually pay people to write for the site, is anybody writing thinner articles than others? And does that actually impact the SEO performance of those articles? Turns out some guy named Frank Vitovich writes the thinnest articles of all the people that write for this website. And at first I was like, well, OK, that's fine. But does this actually impact any performance? Like, is the fact that some of my articles, or almost 20% of them, are being under 1,000 words, does that impact performance? What I did was I combined my author date, or my author name here, along with my rankings from Google Search Console to see what's the distribution of those URLs based on position. And it was pretty clear. When when I looked at it that 25% of the URLs in position 1 had less than 1,000 words. And then as you got to the far end, which is position 10, 46% had less than 1,000 words. So a pretty clear indicator that I need to be writing longer articles when I'm publishing to that website. But just kind of an interesting way, again, mashing up data sources and some values that maybe you hadn't been looking at in the past. Crawl frequency correlations here. I couldn't really find a good Talladega Nights image for this. So when I said crawl frequency correlations, I was like, that would probably confuse Cal Naughton Jr., so we went with that. But this is from a study that we did with Merkle, actually earlier this year, where we looked at a data set across a number of websites to find some, or to test some SEO theories. In this case, we wanted to know, do star ratings impact how frequently Google is crawling the product pages on websites? So what you're looking at here from left to right is 0 to 1 star, all the way up to 5 stars. And those bars are how frequently Google is crawling all of those pages. And as you can see, as you get farther to the right, as you get to 5 stars, Google was crawling the 5-star rated products much more frequently than they were the 1 star or the 2 stars. So again, a couple ways that you could think about using this now. One, if you know that those pages aren't being crawled, one, what do we do to get them crawled? But also, how do we increase the ratings? Now, that's not necessarily something that is thought of as an SEO job, but if you could see it impacting SEO performance, you could take that to other teams that you're working with, and now you're starting to have more strategic conversations within your organization, because I think everybody in this room can attest to having a difficult time sometimes proving the value of SEO changes that are needed. When you show things like this, it usually tends to get people's attention. The next couple are all references to structured data's impact on click-through rate. Again, a lot of these are from the study that we did. It's on a product page impact. Surprisingly, when in stock is in the structured data, click-through rate is much higher than when it's out of stock. Because is better than out. Programmatically say don't include that in the structured data because at the end of the day, even if it's out of stock and you get somebody to your site on it, you could just serve them related products, and you have a much better chance of making a sale that way than if they don't click on your page altogether. We took a look again at star ratings and how they can improve click-through rate. This one was a little inconclusive, so this goes back kind of what I said earlier about trust your own data. Don't take anything that somebody tells you as definitive. But we saw that in general, as products had higher star ratings, the click-through rate was much higher. When we had at a 5-star rating, you're at just at 14% versus a 6% click-through rate when there's 1 or 2. So again, these things may seem kind of obvious, but when you put the data behind it, you can start to make some decisions based on that. The number of reviews also it appeared at least to be impacting click-through rate. When there was no reviews, we were looking at like a 3% click-through rate. But when you get up to 40 to 50, it was between 8 and 9. What was interesting was in this data set, we actually saw that 50 to 100 reviews had a worse click-through rate than the 40 to 50, which was kind of interesting. So again, not necessarily the most conclusive, but it's a way to combine data here. Looks like I got about 2 minutes left, which is great because I only have 1 or 2 more slides. But another one that you could do with structured data is keep an eye on your competitors. We all love to look at competitive rankings and things like that. But when you take a look at the structured data on your competitor sites, you're able to see things like what are their highest rated products? What are their highest rated, if they have article ratings of any kind. And now, you could use that strategically. Maybe it informs your content strategy. Maybe you take that and you give it to your category managers or whoever is in charge of merchandising and things like that. Again, it gives you more strategic, you're able to have more strategic conversations internally. Here's a list of all the resources that I mentioned, so you can click on them. We have our white paper, our webinar. We have, I have a link here to how the Google crawls the web, which actually Mike referenced. By the way, Mike, thanks for the references. The way your talk started, I got a little nervous about how you might, but thank you very much. And then the webinar as well. We're going to be hosting cocktail hour later. I think it's at
5:15.
At 5:15. So come join us. Talk to us. We'll be there all day.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. And we are going to take a question.
Oh, yeah, actually, I was going to say,
Yes.
and if you have questions, Kyle and Will from my team are in the back. They are super smart, and you can, anyway.
Awesome.
Yes.
Questions? All right. Oh, so everyone's saving them for happy hour.
So the question actually is really based on how Google views different industry types. I work with a client who's definitely been whacked by the Fred update,
Yep.
and they lost all their featured snippets, right?
Mm-hmm.
So basically, there was a roadblock between. So, difference do you see?
Two. We focus necessarily. I don't have a great, too much insight into, if a table versus using CSS styling gives you that view in the snippets.
Cool. Thank you, Frank.
No problem.
After party? Yes. You have a wonderful after party at Antico Forno, which is very close nearby. They are doing apps, dinner, and thanks, conductor. Okay. Next up, we have Sean Malseed from Green Lane. And he's gonna give it to you in regards to APIs. Sean?
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Awesome. My name's Sean. I'm from Green Lane Search Marketing in Philadelphia, and I hate to disappoint you, but I'm also an Eagles fan. We're everywhere. Today I'm going to be talking about APIs and actually how undocumented API helped us solve a pretty big problem for a client. And also became very popular. Ways that people come across Green Lane for technical SEO. A little about me. There for about 4 years. Business, and I did some consulting. In Rush for a number of years. I was actually in charge of API integrations with clients there. I'm not a professional developer by any stretch, but I like to think of myself as an extreme amateur developer, or maybe better phrased as knows enough to be dangerous professionally. And what I think that means is I'm never going to be like a great developer, but probably my main goal would be to be able to work alongside a great developer as they implement stuff, and also to bridge the gap between the people who decide what needs to be implemented and the people actually doing that implementation, which I think is an important role for technical SEOs. I'd also like to mention that there will be free spaghetti during this presentation. And by spaghetti, I mean some code that I wrote. It's not very attractive code. It's not very well organized, hence the term spaghetti. But it does work, and it's stuff that we use all the time. And I hope you'll find it as useful as we do. This spaghetti can be deployed to the cloud in an interesting way. And also, this might be the best stock photo on the internet. And we paid for this, and I have no regrets. And then I just tried to take it. That's too far, I'm sorry. APIs. So if you're not too familiar with APIs, or you've heard the term thrown around but you've never seen it in action, What an API is, well, it stands for Application Programming Interface. Basically, it's a way for two computers to talk to one another over a network like the internet, quickly, efficiently, reliably. So a good example could be if you have a stock app and you type in like the stock, and then it sends it off to the server somewhere in stock land in New York, and the stock server says, okay, this is the ticker, here's the company name, here's the price, here's other stock things. And then the developers program the app so that it formats all that data into the interface, into the user. It's just a seamless experience, even though it's pulling data from maybe all sorts of disparate sources on the internet. So with that in mind, APIs are really intended for developers who are trying to build robust dynamic applications. But the secondary kind of person who might be interested in an API is one of the kind of people that are probably here today. And two kind of primary ways of finding APIs. There's published APIs. A great example is Google's extremely comprehensive list in their API Explorer. They have crazy stuff in there, even like natural language processing APIs that they just make available to anybody. But what we're going to talk about today are unpublished APIs, which are a lot more fun to find, and sometimes you can do some interesting things just from poking around on a site and trying to see how it works. So there's a story with our client. Client had a problem, and the story begins like most other stories do. We had to overcome the problem. And you might be familiar with this problem, and that's we submitted some URLs to Google in a sitemap, and Google indexed some of them. So of course, we want to see however many URLs we submitted, that's how many is indexed. But more often than not, we see we submitted a ton of URLs, and they're not all indexed. The way to diagnose that historically is in Google info search operator and see if it comes back. If it does, indexed. If not, not indexed. But the problem is that doesn't really scale. So our client in particular had literally a bajillion pages. They were basically a platform for people to find really hyper-local service providers. So people would generally find the site by searching for service in town or service in city. So this client, since the beginning of time, set up their site with a local landing page for literally every town and city in America. Yeah, it's a little crazy, but that's how they set it up, and it worked. And since the beginning of their company, some of those pages, like the Philly page, tons of traffic, tons of revenue and everything, but then other pages got zero traffic. And the question, of course, is, are they getting no traffic because it's not indexed, or is it because people aren't actually searching in that town, or what? And we can't go into the client, of course, and say, hey, this is crazy. We want to just erase all of this and do something different, because they'll tell you you're crazy, why, and probably fire you. Fortunately, we're not the only one with this problem. And actually, if you type "are my pages" into a Google search, the first suggestion is "are my pages indexed in Google?" and the second suggestion is "why are my pages not indexed in Google?" Which is pretty fitting. And you can find a lot of solutions. Most of them are something like this. A bunch of proxies plugged into some kind of web scraper and do that info search, dump it all into Excel. But there's a lot of pitfalls with that. Like I forgot to put the proxies on. And then there's some problems, and people in the office start looking at you, and they say, why do I have to, what are these puzzles that keep coming up? I say, I don't know what they are. It's not me. And really, it's just because Google can't be cool about it. I mean, they kind of taunt you with exactly how many URLs they've indexed and exactly how many URLs you sent them. But if you say which ones are indexed, figure it out yourself. So that's really frustrating. And when things are frustrating and kind of tedious, my initial response is to just ignore it and procrastinate. So I think maybe the best suggestion I'm going to give today is my top tip for procrastination, which I found to be really successful. And that's if you're just going to click around randomly on the internet, do it with Chrome Developer Tools open, and especially with the XHR tab under Network Requests, because that looks like you're doing something. If somebody walks by your desk and they see all this stuff on the side flying around, They're going to say this guy's doing something. I'm not going to interrupt them. And you can get away with the whole day like this. It's really awesome. But you can also get a little bit of production out of doing this. So in this case here, I'm procrastinating and I'm playing with Google search. I'm searching for skateboards to buy, whatever. I'm old. But if we look in network requests under XHR, we see that actually every time you type a letter into the search box, it's making an API call to somewhere in the Google mothership, and it's coming back with the suggestions. Which is actually crazy if you think about it, because everybody talks about how many searches does Google handle worldwide every second, but it's actually how many times does somebody push a key in the search box every second worldwide. And for every time somebody pushes one letter, it sends something up to the mothership that does some complicated logic to figure out what they think you might be searching for. And that's kind of an intense amount of computer power. But we don't really care about that. What's more interesting is looking inside the API, and we can see it's actually just a very simple list of the suggest keywords for whatever you're trying to search. So that can be kind of helpful. This trick works on lots of websites. Another place you might like to procrastinate is Wikipedia. There's kind of a new feature on Wikipedia. When you hover over a link to another article, it pops up a nice little box with an excerpt and a nice picture. But if you look in network requests when you're doing that, you can see it's actually making an API call every time you hover over one of the links. And if you look inside the API call, there's some interesting information in the response, such as the kind of categories that it's in, links to other APIs that have things like the full text of the article in plain text and the full HTML source. And that's pretty neat stuff. And then if you go to the API URL directly, we can actually access that information directly in a browser. So when you can access information directly, you can basically do anything with it. In this sheet that I've linked here, all I'm doing is using that Google Suggest API and pulling in, just in a formula, suggest keywords for a given keyword. Now, you can take this a lot further. You could, for instance, do a suggest search for each of the suggest keywords automatically and build out a gigantic itself, Google. Or you could take it further. You could use that Wikipedia. See what kind of topics are kind of related to whatever term that you're entering, which ones have an article for them. So I kind of like to think if it pops up or slides across or whatever. And if so, there's a good chance you can kind of. So it's actually a really obscure operating system reference, and if you can see what that reference is in this picture, we should be friends. So poking around on Google, try to see if there's something like the suggest keyword API that can help us with this indexation problem. So going back to just opening network requests and clicking around and visiting those URLs, and all of a sudden, f.txt downloads. I didn't ask it to download. It just kind of force downloaded itself. So that's weird. So what is that? Well, turns out that's an API of the entire SERP. So that could be pretty useful in our situation. And in fact, it was. And that's how we solve the indexation problem. And that also brings us to the first course of Spaghetti, which is that solution. So what we did is we took that f.txt URL, that API URL, and we popped in some spaghetti into the Google indexation, the Google Apps script to make an indexation tester, build a function that we could just pop into a spreadsheet, and it runs in the background. We put it on a timer, and then it'll just blow through an entire list of URLs, searching those URLs as if they were a keyword, then looping through the results. If it's in there, it's indexed. If it's not, or it's empty, then it's not indexed. Now, if you're familiar with Google Apps Script, you might think, well, it times out after 5 minutes, and that's not enough time to run 1 bajillion URLs. But there is something called triggers in Google Apps Script, which is basically makes it like a cron job or like AWS Lambda function or something. And it'll just run forever in Google's cloud or until you delete that trigger. Another question you might have is, well, if I'm just running all these URLs in the background automatically, am I going to just blow up my IP address? Well, the other interesting thing about doing this stuff from inside Google Apps Script or Docs is that it doesn't actually, the request doesn't come from your IP address. The request actually comes from inside Google's cloud. So when you're hitting Google from inside an app script, you're hitting Google from Google, which means that Google's not going to give itself a CAPTCHA, and in fact, it doesn't. So this works great. And we're giving this out. So we packaged it into an SEO tool, gave it out, became pretty popular. A lot of people have seen it. The version that we released is kind of watered down. The reason being is that our internal version does batches of URLs because it's a lot faster, but it doesn't provide obvious immediate feedback. So you click the button and it runs for a while and people say, oh, this isn't working, and they leave. So we made a version that does each URL one at a time so people can see that feedback. It's a lot more user-friendly, but it's also a lot slower. So for us today, this is our internal version. This runs in the background, and actually it has a start button. You click it, it automatically generates that trigger. And it'll just run in the background until it's finished your list of URLs and then delete the trigger. You don't even have to keep the tab open. You can close it, log out of Google, throw your computer away, whatever. And this will just run forever until it's finished. So this is something we use all the time at Green Lane, and I hope that you guys will find it useful as well. So what else can we do with it? So one thing that we thought is, what if we play with the parameters in the API URL a little bit? So the top 100 search results, SERP tracker. So this is something we use all the time. All it does is every day it makes a new column in the sheet, top until the end of time, or it runs out of how. But this is really helpful, of course, if you want to track minor SERP fluctuations, or you want to see somebody publishes articles frequently, how quickly are they watch that daily SERP fluctuation. As the indexation tool manually, it's pretty there. And forget. So a pretty big within that benefit of hitting Google from within. If we want and wrap it in our like an API exception. And so that's exactly what we did. So one of the other really interesting things about Google Apps Script is that it doesn't have to be attached to a document. It can run just on its own in the cloud, just like an Amazon function. This for free. And if you publish it as a web app, then it gives you a URL, and then it'll run your function and give you whatever result. And that works exactly like an API that you just literally built in Google Apps Script. That is something called cross-origin request sharing. If you've never heard of that, that is build something that on Google. Chrome is going to yell at you and say, no, around that is to not use cores and instead script. There's a little function called JSONP that takes all the results, pops it into just a JSONP format, takes jQuery's JSONP functionality, returns the callback just as expected, and then you can basically do your own stuff. All of you really talked about it. So this version of it is a script that does the top 100 search results, and you give it a domain and a keyword, or a URL and a keyword, and it gives you back the rank, and it works extremely quickly because it's getting that from Google, to Google, and then just pulling that result down through this kind of wrapper code. And then you can use it to do basically anything. Like you could build like a whole back end out of it, basically. And as a this site just built in Ember.js. It's pretty simple, but it hits that Google App Script API, and it has some additional error handling, and then a nice export function. And we've been able to run thousands of keywords through it at a time, and it comes back extremely quickly. So it seems to work fine, and it's pretty fun. So that's everything I have. So in case you see this later, here's all the links that we used. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great, and we do have time for questions. Yep, right there, okay. There you go.
Script, and it does why it would be doing that?
Did you write the scraper in Google Apps?
Coworkers here.
Oh, so I think what their problem, right? So this is that internal is probably what they've done, which is try to does give captchas, I think, to Google Apps Script. Run through thousands of keywords and never hit a snag. Yeah.
Great. A question in the back.
That was really cool, Sean. There is a extra serving of spaghetti that you haven't mentioned. I play in National Legion, so I might have seen the indexation to more of those.
Specifically, because we never change how the backend works with that. So you can no longer force a Google version by visiting the. Even if you're, hitting google.co.uk, it's going to give you the US version. So unfortunately, we had something sort of like that, but internationally, but it doesn't work anymore.
I was just curious if you ever did change your function to not scrape the pages directly, because I remember a long time ago I did find your spreadsheet with that, and it doesn't scrape the pages directly, so you can't get stuck anymore.
Yeah, some of the original versions that we had of this, they did get stuck after a while, and it wasn't due to the way it scraped. It was because of just error handling in that API wrapper script. So sometimes we get a weird version of the SERP, and that would fail. So now we account for every possible version actually by looping through the whole, every block of the SERP and looking for the right location instead of always expecting it in the same spot.
And then if I could also, I don't know if I read it, if it was mentioned today, that the Google index that you get in the search results isn't necessarily what they have in their index, and that you have to actually look at the server logs to get the true indexed pages. What do you think about that?
I mean, that's all part of the puzzle. I mean, none of this is like the canonical, I don't think there's any tool that's the canonical reference except for whatever's in Google. So you should really be looking at all that stuff. I mean, there was a great presentation earlier about server logs, and I think that stuff is extremely important to know. This gives us a really great hint, especially when we're doing this stuff in bulk, because we can set it, forget it, do some other stuff, and investigate other issues and look at server logs and come back to this and kind of compare the whole thing together. And I think that's what everyone should be doing.
Hey, Sean. Right here. Hey.
Hey.
So I think a lot of us have played this game before with Google Sheets, and we can hit a Google undocumented API from Google's own internal IP address. I still get nervous with this. Like if I use my personal email address to hit an undocumented Google API, I haven't seen any issues yet, but like looking ahead to the future, is this something that we should be, creating a new Gmail address for? Do you worry about this at all?
All right. Well, so for example, on that real keyword, because who knows if somebody's going to come on there and just that doesn't happen, but whatever. Like what they tweeted at me, scraping the search, the search result page. We found, it's fine.
Search engine land that did the same thing, but scraping the interface, and John.
I remember that article. It was very cool.
John got quite mad at me.
Yeah,
as well.
I was very disappointed that you no longer recommend it because it's a very cool way of doing it.
Sure.
Great. Well, thank you, Sean. That was awesome. Let's give him a hand.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's awesome. Thank you.
All right. For everyone at Catalyst. Innovation and great content.
So I'm not going to mention them. Okay, so by the way, this is going to be way simpler than everything that you've heard today. I want to get dirty with programming, a little bit interested in basics of computer programming. That's me. I'll skip that. TechSEO. There's a lot of benefits to learning programming. It's going to make your work way, way more efficient. If you know how to program, you can build a tool that does cater to what you need. On the web development side of things, it's going to enable you to sort of understand where your developers are coming from, speak their language, understand how it all works. And this I do want to drive home, and this is somewhat, don't take this the wrong way, but computer programming is becoming a piece of basic literacy. You have children in elementary school learning how to program. These people are going to enter the workforce. If you don't know how to program or don't have any concept of computer programming, you might have a trouble with your job in the future. That's if the robots don't come and take over. So
There's also this. There's this concept that computer programming is really, really hard. And I don't want to detract from very, very skilled engineers. There is a difference between an entry-level programmer, someone who knows a little bit to get their hands dirty, but isn't an expert, isn't a software engineer. I think there's a big difference between someone who knows how to program and a very skilled software engineer as well. But the very basics of computer programming are relatively easy. I think you'll get some of that today. Okay, so let's dive in. At this point, you might be asking, I want to learn how to program. Which programming language should I start with? And the answer to that question is they're all good. You can learn any given programming language, and you're going to have a much greater understanding of how every other programming language works, because there's a lot of logical similarities between them. Pretty much every programming language, except for there's definitely nuances there, but you're going to get the basic logic that is transferable to another programming language that is transferable to another programming language by learning one. So if you're you're at a point in which your programming knowledge is still valuable. That being said, if you're starting from square one, I do have some recommendations for you. Number one, if you're interested a little bit in web development, JavaScript. If you're interested in data analysis, Python. So, JavaScript. JavaScript is the de facto programming language of the front-end web. It is an amazing place to start your programming career, especially nowadays. Not only is it the language of the front-end web, but it's becoming one of the de facto languages of back-end web. There's great parity between having your back-end code running on the same language that your front-end code is running on. So if you're interested in web development, JavaScript is really an excellent place to start. It's going to be very transferable. Now, if you're interested in more data analysis work, I'm going to recommend Python. There's amazingly robust libraries that help with data analysis in Python. Opening up a Jupyter notebook and being able to dig into some of those things like Brittany Muller shared on Google Colab, which is Google's interface to Jupyter notebooks, is a very, very rewarding experience, and you can get a lot done using Python. R is also really good for that. I find Python to be a little bit more robust nowadays with Python. Step one, you're gonna need to download Python. You go to python.org, you download Python. Easy. Step two, and also, I should mention this. If you're really interested on the data analysis portion of Python, especially if you're running Windows, I recommend getting the Anaconda's distribution of Python. It's going to make your life a lot easier. It comes pre-built with a lot of libraries and tools to make the data analysis aspect of Python a little bit easier. Step two, and this is true of many programming languages, you're going to need a code editor, a text editor. Python is an interpreted programming language, which means you're just running a text script through that interpreter. So all you really need is a text editor. You don't need like a complicated IDE or anything of the sort. So depending on what your preferences are, what operating system, here's a bunch of options for you. I tend to use Atom nowadays, but these are all good. It's a matter of preference. OK, on to the basics. And we'll use Python as an example. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to run through JavaScript. But I think, again, a lot of this will be transferable. Step one, you got to open a text editor. Step two, we're going to create what is the simplest computer program in every world. You enter the code. The quotation mark at this point. .py file. You've already installed Python. You type Python, hello. first Python program. Hard stuff, right? Variable and the really important in computer programming. You can assign value, which is a value that is either true or false, or it could be some sort of array, or in Python that would be like a list or a tuple. So some examples. So we have 4 variables on this screen right now. First variable is full_name. That's your x. That's your x. The value is, in quotation marks, Paul Shapiro. That's your 7. So the value of the variable full name is Paul Shapiro. We have another variable in there, age equals 29. That's my age. Is SEO. This is a Boolean variable. It's equal to true. That could also be equal to false, but it's true. And then lastly, the last one is a type of array in Python known as a list. Instead of a variable being equal to just one value, it's essentially a list of values that we can then access later. So here's a list of board games that I like to play. So string, number, integer, Boolean, list, type of array. If this is confusing, let's put it in terms that I think all SEOs are familiar with, Excel. So if all those variables called full name are equal to a set of names, then we could access that variable by calling that cell A2. So equals A2 is the value of that variable. And if we were to reference A2, it would print that name. OK. Let's go a little bit further. Conditional statements. These are things like if, else, if. And it's just that. If that condition is true, let's execute some code given that it's true. So we'll go through this line by line. First, we're setting, and this is denoted by the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. First line of code is we're creating a variable known as subject. Subject is equal to a dictionary, which is like a type of array in Python. And that subject variable has various values associated with it. It has a Boolean value associated with where the animal value is equal to true, and its temperament is equal to grumpy. Then we create our conditional statement. And now this is just very logical. This is almost like English vocabulary. If the subject animal is true, it is an animal, and the temperament of that subject is grumpy, then let's print out the text, animal is a cat. Let's give it an alternative. If it is in case an animal and the temperament is playful, then we'll print the text, the animal is a dog. So if neither of those else and is an animal, we in fact know that this program will print out that it's a grumpy cat. OK. And in terms of Excel, this should be familiar. If statements are a function in Excel. You can do an if statement in Excel. It's the same thing, except we're referencing variables, and we can do more complex things with this. So we have a series of animals. We determine if they are an animal or not, true or false. And we give them the temperament. If the temperament is true, if B2 is true, and C2 is grumpy, print cat, else print something else. Loops. OK. This is all going to come together in the end, I promise. We're doing this one at a time. There's 2 basic types of loops. There's a while loop and a for loop. And a while loop, this is the logic here. We're going to loop through everything as long as the condition is true. Now, a for loop is we're going to just loop for a specified number of times. And in Python, this is a little bit it's a bit of a variant compared to some other programming languages, but it's a little bit more about iterating over a sequence, but the logic still holds true. Let's give some examples. So the while loop. We're going to create a variable. This is number 1, I. The variable name is I. We give it a value of 1. 2, we're going to initiate this while loop. We're going to say while I is less than or equal to 5. We've initiated that. So as long as I is less than or equal to 5, we're going to do something. And then line 3, as long as that statement is true, we're going to print the value of 5. So starting off, I is equal to 1. So the first thing it's going to do, it's going to come around, it's going to print 1. Then line 4 is we're going to increment that value. So that once that line executes, we're going to make the value of I plus 1. So after it prints the value of 1, it's going to make I equal to 2. And then it's going to loop again. Next time it comes around, I is going to be equal to 2. It's going to print that out. And then it's going to make I equal to 3. And it's going to do this until I is no longer equal to 5, or is no longer less than or equal to 5. This doesn't translate as well into Excel, but I'll try to sort of conceptualize this. So we have a column that is I, and that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then we have a column that evaluates whether it's true. And it's going to go through each one of those rows and make the decision whether I is less than or equal to 5, at which the point it gets to 6, I is no longer less than or equal to 5, becomes false, and the loop ends. Code stops executing. The for loop. So we're going to create a variable, and it is a list of board games. These are my 3 favorite board games right now. Play 3 days straight board gaming convention, so I'm really, really excited. OK. Spirit Island. That's line 1. Line 2. For X in board games that we can then execute within the loop. Line 3, we're going to board games. So essentially, this is going to go, there's 3 values within the Spirit Island. For each one of those, it's going to come through, loop again. It's going to print Great Western Trail. It's going to loop again. And the last time, it's going to print Spirit Island. The program's going to end. It's your for loop. Well, again, loops don't translate perfectly without using like VBA scripting in Excel, but essentially, think of row each time it's going to loop through. We have a column that is our list of board game in a. It's going to come through the first row, print out Great Western Trail, print out the last one, which is Spirit Island. Code ends. OK, functions. Functions are really, really important to making reusable code. And that's essentially what you're doing. You're making reusable code that can be passed something called a parameter, which makes it a little bit more dynamic in nature. To give a basic example, we're going to start on line 1. We're going to create a function called send email. So we're going to define send email with a parameter called address. Line 2, and this is what happens when you evaluate this function. We're just going to print the text email sent to plus that parameter. So it's going to print out the text of whatever's being sent to that function, email sent to an email address. Line 3 is actually executing that function. So we say send email with a parameter of foo@bar.com. The output of this will be email sent to foo@bar.com. And in terms of Excel, this is actually, this is everything you're doing in Excel for the most part. You're executing a function. So every time you do a VLOOKUP is a function. That is a predefined bit of code that is reusable for your day-to-day needs by the Microsoft team that put together Office. OK. This is the last programming concept I want to give you guys, and that is libraries and modules. So for the most part, you can create your own, but these are pre-made code tools that you can use and import into your existing code to expand what you're doing. There's already great things made for you to help with your programming, and you just have to leverage them. And the way these work is, you know that there's a great library out there. You look up the documentation. It adheres to all these different logics, but they really a matter of referencing. In data analysis world, and Python analysis, there's also things like NumPy. If you're doing machine learning work, there's import request, which is that's another library. Okay. Explain a little bit. So using grep words. Thanks, Russ Joan, for providing grep words. It's a great tool for your SEOs out there. It'll provide you lots of keyword data. And the way this works is an API is essentially just a URL. You can take this endpoint, is the terminology, type it into your web browser, and you'll see the output of the API. Before you do that, you do have to provide it some data, but it's just a URL. So you need something called an API key. This is a form of authentication, similar to a password. So in a URL parameter, you're providing that password to authenticate. Say, I am the person using this API. This is my username. This is my password. And then you're feeding it a variable. In this case, it's another URL parameter of q, which will be equal to a keyword of sorts. And if you're thinking ahead a little bit, this is a variable. We're going to end up looping through this. Okay, so you take this URL, and there's an API key provided, and there's a value to that variable provided. Let's say board games is the keyword that we're looking at. You type this into your web browser, and this is the output you're going to receive. This is a format called JSON. There's several different common formats that APIs tend to output. JSON's a big one. XML is a big one. Sometimes you see things like plain text and CSV. You don't really have to worry about how to read this. You're going to build the computer program, and the computer program is going to interpret it for you. But in this case, there's a field called GMS from the grepwords API, and that is equal to the search volume. So if I type in board games, search volume, 246,000. OK, now we're going to put everything together. Let's write a piece of Python code that will loop through a list of keywords and output the search volume. Line 1, we're going to import a library called requests. Requests is a library that basically helps you execute APIs and download URLs. We're going to import another one on line 2 called JSON. JSON helps you parse JSON. Line 3, we're going to create a variable called board games. Values Gaia Project, Great Western Trail, Spirit Island. Line 4, we're going to initiate a for loop. For x in that board games variable, we're going to do a bunch of stuff. The first thing we're going to do on line 5 is we're going to create another variable. That variable is called API URL. And there's 2 parts to it. The first part is that first bit of text that is the URL, the API endpoint, with my unique API key. And then we're adding another variable to that variable called x, which is going to be the keywords from the list. So now this is looping through. The first time around, it is going to download that first URL with the first board game in the list. Then we're going to go to line 6. Request is going to do something. It's going to create this object called R, which is the downloaded JSON. Line 7, we're going to parse that JSON using that JSON library. Again, I just looked at the documentation. It said, if you want to parse JSON, this is the format you need to use. And it's going to go ahead and parse it. Line 8, we're going to print out just that GMS field. So the end of this, it's going to go through. It's going to execute everything under 4. It's going to go through and the next board game. It's going to execute everything. It's going to go through the last board game. It's going to execute everything. And then it's going to stop. And this is what it looks like. So I'll go Python, combining concepts.py, and you saw that sort of one at a time. Outputs the search volume, went through the second part of the loop, outputs the search volume, goes through the third time, outputs the search volume. 7 lines of code. You just built a computer program in Python that executes an API. This is towards the end, right? OK. So how can you go about learning? There's tons of great resources to learn how to code out there. When I was learning how to code in like middle school, I had to go to a library. And that's how I first learned how to code. You don't have to do that anymore. This is all freely available online. You don't need to read a book. There's tons of like interactive tutorials, and it's all way easier than it used to be. Again, I think this has been mentioned before. I definitely recommend actually doing this in practice as a way of learning. It's a really valuable way of learning how to code. These slides are going to be available later. I don't need to read one of them off. But yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. We'll do a quick. We have some time.
What are you going to ask me about?
I don't know, guys. What do you want to know? Who has questions for Paul? Anyone? Questions on Python, getting started?
So if you could export some of your personal data but not have an API, how would you access that data?
Right. So there's many ways to access data. API is a common one, obviously, because it's a lot easier. But you can import data from pretty much any data source. If it's an Excel document, you can use that as a data source. It's a CSV. If it's a database, that's just another way you can access data. And there's modules and ways of accessing that within all modern programming languages.
Hi, Paul.
What's up, Mike?
Quick question for you. So you showed like 5 different libraries that you're using.
Yeah.
What are some of the other must-use libraries outside of the more popular ones that you just listed, at least for you and the work you're doing?
Yeah, so if you're doing data analysis, I mentioned this already, but like Pandas is like my go-to, and that's going to take care of so much that I have to repeat that. Other things like NLTK is for natural language processing. There's another one that I'm blanking on for natural language processing that has like a C++ backend, so it's a little bit fast. Spacey is phenomenal in terms of plotting. Matplotlib is the big one, but I started doing more data analysis in R, and there's ggplot, and that's been ported to Python, and I like the language that is ggplot. Yeah, I mean, this hasn't been mentioned before, but you go to github.com. GitHub.com is essentially, it's a way that developers store code, but it's also a little bit of a social network. And if you have a problem to solve, there's oftentimes someone else who's solved it already, and you can use that as a search engine to sort of, I don't know what library to use. Maybe someone's put up a library on GitHub or another place. So sort of depends on your application, but I definitely recommend seeing what other people have put out there.
Great. One question in the back.
Hey, Paul. Just had a quick question in terms of what you use on a daily basis or on a regular basis when you leverage a Python program that you've created. What are the most frequently used ones that you personally use?
What sort of like libraries or?
No, specifically like applications you've built with Python for your clients or personal use.
So we do a lot of things with data analysis. So importing large data sets, maybe accessing our own internal database, and then doing a series of analyses on the data from those databases. It doesn't sound that exciting because it's highly relevant to like my personal day-to-day job, but that's that's the sort of value you get out of learning how to code. Is like I have a hyper-specific program for my hyper-specific needs that probably doesn't help you as much, but it's really, really valuable to me. I'll do things that just, a program that will put things in the right format or segment my data in a very specific way or do a series of computations that would be a little bit rigorous in Excel or impossible due to the size and scope of that data. So I know that's not what you're asking for, but that's sort of the reality of it. Okay.
Cool. Anything else, Paul?
That's okay.
I think we're good. Thank you so
Awesome.
much, Paul. Quick break, our last break of the day. 25-ish, and then we'll do our sort of last chunk of the day. We have a lot of exciting things planned for this last part of the day. So come back 3:25. See you then.
Hello world, I am Vincent Terrazi and I manage the data. Hello world, I am Vincent Terrazi and I manage the data marketing teams at OVH.
All right, guys, we're going to start to get ready for our last chunk of content here. So if everyone could start to take their seats, we'll be resuming in just another minute or two. Thanks. All right, guys, we're going to get started with our second panel of the day. Paul.
Hello, Blue X on stage again. I know you well. Next up, we have our panel on testing, research, and experimentation. I called this our unofficial theme of Tech SEO Boost this year. We're going to start off with this panel, and then we're going to unveil the call for research finalists after this. But without further ado, our panelist members, Rob Bucci, former CEO of Stat, now the head of R&D at Moz. Yeah! Woo! Thank you. Sit over here. Rob, with Moz and Stat, has done amazing research and knows this topic quite well. Ashley Berman-Hale, now of Deep Crawl, but known around the web for being awesome and her great work in the SEO industry. Michael Briggs, joining us from Glasgow. Michael is the head of SEO at Skyscanner. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes. Skyscanner, obviously, being a big brand, is quite well versed in testing and experimentation. Last but not least, Mike Tekula. He's a VP over at Distilled in New York. Distilled has their ODN platform for conducting split testing for SEO. I think he's got some great insight to share. If anyone wants to augment anything I said, and we are taking audience questions throughout this. If anyone wants to share on Twitter, out there on the live stream, we'll have someone run up and share some of those questions with our panelists.
Gentle questions.
Gentle questions.
The hard ones come after the cocktails.
That's why we come here in person. Sorry, live streamers. For those of us that aren't running SEO tests and experiments, what's a good starting point? What sort of tests should we be running? I'll start all the way over here with Rob, and anyone could jump in with any sort of insights that they may have.
Sure. The answer to that question is a very annoying, well, it depends.
You must do SEO.
I know, right? What's the answer to that? I don't know, it depends. And it's the reason why I say it depends is because it depends on what aspect of your practice you're trying to test. Like, for me, what I'm familiar with is testing SERPs, testing SERP visibility, testing keywords. And so, like building a keyword corpus, doing your keyword research. Everything else is going to be bunk. But for different.
If you have support in your company, test something that Google has said that you don't have proof of. because people love that. If you don't yet have full support or business backing, then test something you yourself are really, really curious about, because you're going to need that drive to push through.
Oh,
Sometimes to build like that, the business getting excited, you want to test something that the business cares about, like test a revenue thing, test some money something, right? Because people are going to get behind that.
So why should we do that? Why shouldn't we just blindly accept our overlord's statements?
You're setting me up, because I'm known as like the
Yeah.
soft fangirl for Google.
Yeah, I mean, you might have some sort of association.
Yeah.
But
Inquisitive minds
Yeah.
are beautiful things.
Yeah, okay. So why shouldn't you trust what it said in the Whiteboard Friday? Sorry, I'm using that as an example, if anybody's here.
we love you, Rand.
We do, but the whole industry wakes up every sort of Friday afternoon, Monday morning, depending where you are, and goes out and does what this thing says. If everyone is doing exactly the same thing, I can find a competitive advantage by experimenting. If you're running one way, I can go another way and find different ways. That gives me opportunities. I see it as being that, but that could just be the sort of reformed spammer in me. That I like the gaps.
But that's that innate curiosity that drives really great work, right?
Yeah, completely.
We used to always focus on like trying to always this forever and always, and we realized really quickly how that was like impossible to do all the time, but also not productive. And we at some people an example, but focusing on the methodology. Or vertical, rather than like just do this thing. Yeah.
For SEO, which is a little different from A/B testing from CRO, in that you can't split your audience into two groups and give one group each version of your experience. Viable for big sites, e-commerce sites are a common example. But one of the things we found is that there's title tag formulas and things like that. We've tried those same, or it's very similar formulas on other sites in different verticals and found totally different results. Or even something like on a category page, for example, if you might have some boilerplate like SEO copy on that category page, removing that, we've found mixed results, some positive tests, some null tests, some negative tests. So there's really nothing that's like a universal factor that you could take away and run with, even if you're watching an experimentation program pretty closely. You need to test for your own site.
Wasn't your original question? I kind of went off.
Yeah, that's the fine.
I do that. But you were asking like, where do you start? Right?
Yeah, where should you start?
Yeah, and this was really interesting. This is an interesting topic. Like, how do you, if you could test anything, how do you decide what am I going to test today, or what am I going to test tomorrow, and how do you like stack rank your priorities of testing? Like for me, as someone who used to own a business, I would think about like I care most about testing the things that are either going to reduce cost or drive revenue. And I would start there, but that might be different for you folks.
I have no business acumen. Thank God somebody pays me. So I like to start small and think about what variables I can isolate, because before I design an experiment, it's really important to me to think about how I can measure it and how I can iterate. So it may not be revenue specific, but it's...
You just said something there. How can I isolate a variable? In SEO, this is something that's very, very challenging.
Yeah. Hashtag impossible.
How do we do a controlled experiment? Is that even possible?
Yeah. So when I said isolate,
I know what you meant. I'm just there's a great.
So the isolation thing's always a big problem they face. I have a team of experimental scientists who do lovely CRO experiments, and then they see the way that I run experiments, and they look at me like I'm crazy. They're like, this makes no sense. This isn't the way we do things. Over the last couple of years, they've become more and more involved in what we're doing, to the extent, when I checked my laptop this morning, I had a set of engineers who'd been running experiments on sitemaps who were working with the experimental scientists to now work out what the impact of releasing 20 million URLs in the market looked like, and various things like that down to the sort of session level. So bringing the people with us as we're sort of doing things and trying to understand their language has been the sort of best way of doing things. Also the fact that Google released that library in R, that meant I could go to them and go, Google says this is okay, right? And this is like the way that we can now measure, has now meant that it's easier to get people on board. But that also helped with the democratization of experiments. It's not just SEO people who should be running experiments, but anybody who's changing anything on your front end can actually track through from editorial to images to anything. what's actually going on. So.
Because it's so hard to like control those variables too, like it's impossible with the SERP. There are myriad variables, and so we could sometimes go, here's a finding and here's like 50 caveats, and it just completely undercuts the finding. We've also adopted this approach of making the research easily repeatable so that we can run it again and again and again at different times of the day, different times of the year, after different updates that may have been done, just to sort of show that there is a consistent pattern. Like it's kind of chaos in the noise, or sorry, it's finding signal in the noise by just like repeating it. Yeah, just repeating it over and over and over and over, and hopefully it's like a static finding.
Yeah, and the repetition is probably quite good because we've got about, I think, about 35 domains, and there's a set of them that nobody actually manages, where I can just go and play. So I can do things like just delete whole sections off websites and see what happens.
Which domains are those?
DeepCrawl has a good testing
There's
domain
certain
too.
markets out there that nobody actually currently owns. So
got it.
I can
Okay.
do things like drop traffic by 16% and nobody notices.
That's awesome.
Because I deleted whole sections off the footer links and various stuff. Yeah, it's always good. Just don't get caught, right? I really hope nobody from work's watching this. They're not going to start working at the domains I've been breaking recently.
What?
It's fine.
And the nature of SEO is that no one's watching. All right, so Mike, given that Distilled operates a platform dedicated for split testing, I was wondering if you had any sort of insights there in terms of controlling variables, or what's the methodology that how we should be thinking about operating, an SEO experiment?
Sure. So given that you have to split your pages into groups and deploy your variable or your hypothesis to one group, it doesn't make sense to just control your control versus your variant performance in real time. It's best to build a model, and this is where causal impact or Bayesian inference is pretty handy, but to build a model for how those pages would have performed had you done nothing and compare your actual performance to that model. Which for most people that have kind of tinkered with CRO, that's another level of statistical analysis that maybe is beyond the average practitioner. But with causal impact, you can get, I would say it's not a perfectly controlled experiment, and you're still operating in kind of a confidence interval, or you have a percentage of confidence. But yeah, causal impact can help you kind of suss out some of the noise and other things that can go on when you're running a split test across multiple pages.
It's like AA testing.
Yeah, I guess you can put it that way. Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
Like Alcoholics Anonymous
like,
in my
head. In CRO world, that's what they call it, AA testing.
I'm just a daft lad from Scotland.
All right. To separate, also we've been talking about experimentation, but there's also SEO research, and that's more of the lines with the type of things that Rob has done and has focused on. So in terms of research, what do you need to start doing research in the SEO space?
So just focusing on the domain which I'm comfortable in, so I don't sound like an idiot. When it starts with your queries, right? And you want to make sure that you remove as much bias from your queries as possible. The easiest way to do that is to go really big, like pick 1 million keywords, because you're not going to be humanly able, with your monkey brain, to put bias into 1 million queries. There's too many queries, and we like to create novel aggregations of these queries. So you're going to have like 1 million queries, but then you're going to slice it in like 1,000 different ways. These queries all have a certain number of words in them. These queries all deal with a certain intent or on a certain topic. These queries have a search volume of 50 to 100, and those ones are 100 to 1,000, and those ones are 1,000 to 5,000. These queries have this section of the site ranking for them, and these queries have that section of the site ranking for them. So when you actually gather all those SERPs, you can then fall back on all those segments to be able to start to find a pattern, right? Like you have to do that first before you actually go and gather the data, because you might have 1,000 keywords that are actually in 5 different segments, because it has 500 search volume as that part of the site, and that allows you to actually retroactively pull insights out that you might not have been able to predict. So that query research, segmentation for novel aggregations of queries is crucial to the kind of research we do.
So if we broke that down, you need a lot of data.
Yeah.
And you need a way of segmenting that data.
Yeah, basically. It's so much more eloquent.
Oh.
It is. I'm going to take even a further but the difference between us as SEOs or as programmers or anything else is that we usually want to confirm bias. So we might set up an experiment in order to get the data that we think is true versus a true scientist would go out and just find data looking for the truth. So before you design an experiment, if you could think about what you want to be true and try to take a step back and remove that, which I think is really difficult to do. Implicit bias is really hard to recognize, but even with very dry experiments, we need to be doing that.
I really like that too. Deciding what you want to prove or disprove, but then also being willing to like find the value and not discovering what you hope to discover is actually really important. Sometimes like as valuable as getting to the truth that you'd hope to get to.
Yeah. And there was a sort of SEO god complex, which sort of builds up, right?
Yeah.
We get employed by businesses to turn up and say, if you make this change, things will happen and it's an improvement. You have to be very sort of confident in your workplace that they're willing to go and take failure. Okay? And sometimes that's really difficult for us as human beings to be able to go to our boss and go, we've ran these experiments this month and we've learned nothing, right? Or we've learned that what we thought we knew is now untrue. And we're going to have to rethink a lot of different things, you know? Maybe in agencies that's a lot more difficult than it is. If you have clients who are like, why isn't my graph going up? Yeah. I ran 20 experiments and nothing happened, sorry. That's probably not a great answer.
Yeah, one of the kind of uncelebrated gains of running split testing, valid result that shows that whatever you hypothesize is actually going to cause a downturn in traffic. That saves the organization rolling that out and suffering that loss. And oftentimes those are the kind of things that can easily just kind of go under the carpet, or everyone will just change the subject. If there's a test that's run and it's either very woolly or it seems to be negative, but it's not clear. With actual, valid split testing, you can just validate how much, what the impact was, and if it's a downturn, you can avoid that downturn. So that's often the...
Sure, even when there's a neutral result, there's value there, because if instead of blindly recommending you change 10 million URLs, you can say that okay, that won't really have an impact, and I don't have to roll this across the entire website. So right, there's definitely value there.
Yep. It's kind of the beauty of the research. Like no matter what the outcome is, you're guaranteed to be less stupid at the end of it than you were at the start of it, no matter what the outcome is.
About failed experiments, I don't know if any member of the panel has experiment or an idea that resulted as the result of a failed experiment that they are.
I know not of these failures you speak of.
Depends what you consider a failure. There's always a caveat in there somewhere, I guess. The biggest failure was sort of having to say that I don't know as much as I thought I did. Agency background, so I probably wrote audits for about 8 years of my life and told companies that if you change X and do Y, your traffic will go up. And my biggest sort of failure, which was, this stuff's probably not true. Things like, for example, you can still make a page rank with no content in it if you still throw a lot of links at it, even though everybody will tell you you're not meant to do that stuff these days, right? The user signal should be terrible if a page has no content, convinced that you must have that product because Google has said you have that product. And then they stay on your website longer, and then they have deeper interaction, you have better signals coming back, right? It's more about thinking about that thought process and getting to the end that way, I think. Or I can give far worse examples of things I've written.
How about, what's one test that...
Are you sure I can't say two?
You can say two.
This one really excites me. So there are two tests that I'd really like to run that I haven't been able to design, and they both have to do with people more so than data. So I do a lot that everyone writes out there is available to the broadest audience, whether it's data limit site or hearing. I've never been able to run a test where I have made a specific top 2 rankings or CRO. And I'm very curious because I would love to have the argument in my back pocket to get more businesses to invest in accessibility. I can't do that yet. And then I think the other one is really just representation. So it's important to me that we localize in the sense that people who we're talking to can see themselves reflected in the images content of your site. I think that's something we could do. Like I call it like, you know, scrubbing out 40% of the white men on all of our websites. But I haven't been able to
for me, because we're at Stat, we always focused on this one specific area. You know, we want to be the best at this one thing. It did create some amount of myopia. Like we only deal with the SERPs. And after 7 years of doing SERP-based testing and research, I'm now hungry to do a bit more like full loop studies that deal with like traffic patterns. Some of that stuff. So I'm hoping to take the test beyond just like what do we see on the Google SERPs and actually linking it up to like how does that result in a change in how people behave on your site.
Yeah, some of the things that we would love to test more of that are pretty challenging to set up, even with split testing, or maybe especially with split testing, are things like changing the internal link graph of your site. So like some of the stuff that Kevin was sharing earlier, Kevin from Atlassian, around modeling out kind of the power curve, or you might think of it as like a flat versus a pyramid site structure. Proposed changes to internal links are hard to split test because the pages where you're making the changes are not where you expect to see the impact. And you can't obviously split test your entire site and have 2 versions of your site out there. So we have some ideas and we've worked on running those tests, but they're pretty challenging to set up and require a lot of hustle in the beginning to get things right. But yeah, that's one that we haven't been able to pull off yet.
I have an accidental test case for you where it was moving to responsive, but internal links were served dynamically. So for one server agent, half of them disappeared. So it's good data.
What was the result from that?
I'll tell you about it. It was not good.
That's the Botify.
It's also really tricky to find. Dynamic serving is tricky like that, but it becomes this unexpected landmine of testing when you realize through dynamic serving your data.
Oh, so on Whoops, pile of pages from every single one of our domains at the same time.
Access.
Yeah.
They'll correlate to a time of night when you're drinking and testing. I don't.
So
he fixed it.
If you have pages that you've no index in a tag and you've got a rel canonical on it, and point somewhere else, no index our pages, and you can't find where it came from. Anyway, that's what happened. The interesting bit that was the whoopsie was the direct traffic on these pages vanished as well, like by about 96%.
Huh.
You know, we're always talking about how much of our traffic indirect is actually sort of dark search. Experiment. That was like a huge sort of finding, you know, that, okay, my graph's doing this, but it looks like this subset of traffic that I'm not even getting credit for is also actually growing in exactly the same sort of way. I don't recommend you run that as a sort of purposeful experiment on money pages. Yeah.
That's like an existential crisis for SEOs.
And it was about day 3, I think my chief operating officer said that I'd been at work long enough and I should probably go home. Was trying to get to the bottom of it, so yeah, it wasn't a fun couple of days.
Mental health vacation.
Yeah.
Okay, I got a question. Have your test results ever diverged from a Google statement? We're coming back to this. Yes, we are. Okay.
I'll take this one. Yeah, so like Think with Google did this article where they talked about how they've seen this big uptick in people doing local queries without the use of modifiers like near me. So people were just writing in like, sushi or jewelry store, and they were so confident in Google's like supremacy that Google would understand exactly what they wanted. And Google was saying, it's okay to do this, you should do this now. You don't have to use near me modifiers because we're so good at what we do. So we tested that and we found that was totally bunk. Like less than 50% of the time when you drop a modifier, a local modifier from your queries, Google does not know how to interpret that as a local intent query and won't surface any local packs. So despite the fact that they were saying this in their published research, it was just totally false.
Yeah, we have found at DeepCrawl we've run some experiments with robots.txt and edge cases that were previously said to do one thing that we've then found that Google counters now, knowing that things change a lot. That was the one file that we expected to have really consistent rules with. So we have run experiments where we are testing truths and found some of them to be untrue. Similarly, it took some digging, but Google said, you could use this tool or that tool. They're basically the same, but we found like a real big difference in terms of testing robot.sec out in the wild versus in GSC, testing the rich data testing tool in GSC versus the structured data testing tool, fetch and render versus URL inspection. For us with problem solving some of those crawling issues.
We had one test where we had a client who sells canvas prints online, and their content was not JS driven. So their category pages, all the products would be there in the source code. They're all marked up properly. But the CSS visibility was turned off until the user scroll was detected, and then the products would be revealed. And this looked fine in fetch and render, and Google was at the time very big on touting their ability to crawl and render JavaScript. But we just kind of had a hunch that the pages would perform better if we just served all that content visibly on first render. And we saw like a 6% uptick in traffic to those pages where we tested that. So that was very counter to what Google would have you believe about their ability to process JavaScript. Or in that case, they didn't even need to process the JavaScript. The products were there in the source code. It was just the visibility of those upon first load that seemed to be the problem.
My favorite one is I've got a couple of experimental sites that I run out of my house where I just sort of do things to see what happens. One of those sites somehow got a link penalty, apparently. I was very surprised by what this experimental site got. My traffic got worse when I got the penalty removed by about 50%. I would have been better off living with the penalty than I was in all the time investment and the loss of traffic that it took. What I did find at the end of that is you can then reavow links by starting to delete them from your disavow file and uploading it. And nobody seems to be checking that from what I can gather so far. So yeah, once you've sort of disavowed, if your rankings start going worse, yeah, you can start taking links back out until you find the sweet spot inside that particular thing.
It's like double jeopardy for bad links kind of thing.
Yeah, it is. It's on a test site, right? I would never do that sort of stuff at work, but for sitting on the couch at night, it's reasonably fun. Yeah, so try and work out where's the tolerance in this? How far can I push it?
Okay. When conducting SEO research, what's the #1 roadblock that someone might encounter? Where are the bottlenecks?
Like from a business perspective or the actual test?
All of the above.
Yeah, me? Okay, I said, so I might as well go. Honestly, this is more of like a procedural organizational thing. It's you get like halfway through the research and you're like wrangling a whole bunch of information and it's swirling around you and you're like, I'm fucked. I have no idea what this is anymore. And you're just like so, you're so self-critical that you're second-guessing every part of your methodology and you're actually like inclined to go back and redo the whole thing halfway through. That's like a major problem. Like we've done that where we've actually like thrown stuff out and then redid it only to realize that it was perfectly good the first time. And so you have to commit to just like getting it to the end, finishing it, shelving it, and moving on to the next thing. That's a major bottleneck for us.
Yeah. I think for us at Deep Crawl on the technical side, parsing is a Google black box. So we know a lot about crawling, we know a lot about rendering, indexing, how they can see everything there, but parsing, we don't always know what engine they're using or how strict they are. We use one parsing engine that's a little more strict than Google, but we don't know how much. And then with web rendering service being so far behind Chrome, that's been really tricky for us, and a lot of our tests are specific to crawling, indexing, and parsing. We need to see that level. So from a technical side, it's that. From any other side, I would just say it's admitting that everything here is correlatory versus causation, and that's stressful. Be like, well, I might be able to find a really strong correlation, but I will never. I can't tell you it's causal. So getting buy-in on a higher level, that's the biggest bottleneck I have.
I guess my one's the concept of low-hanging fruit, which is one of my least favorite expressions in the English language. Everyone believes that there's some sort of low-hanging fruit that magically you can just go and do tomorrow and it will improve things. You know, what we actually find with experimentation is that it's a long-term cumulative process to deliver growth. It's not a silver bullet. You can't go in experimentation thinking you're going to find the philosopher's stone that's going to change your life. It's going to have to be lots of little things that build over a period of time. So yeah, no low-hanging fruit. It's all been eaten.
Best practices. You know, a lot of SEOs live and die by the best practice. What's wrong with this sort of mentality?
Because you'll do the same things tomorrow that you did yesterday and not accept the world's changed. And you will read somebody else's view on the world. The reason you're paid as an SEO is because you can think, not because you can write documents, right? Half these documents will never get read, right? You're there to think. And if you just follow what is codified best practice, yeah, you're going to have a bad couple of years coming up. Because I don't think even Google knows what exactly is going on inside the algorithm at times these days, let alone the people who preach from on high that say they've received a message.
I agree with you. Like that's what's beautiful about this industry is that it's so dynamic and ever changing, and there's nothing about SEO that's rote in any way, you know. So, yeah, throwing out the idea of best practices and just being willing to like interpret the signals and make your judgments based on that.
Yeah, I don't like using the word best practice as much because that's proven and true, but it tends to be super myopic in our industry. We can change little variables. Most industries, when they evolve, go from little mechanical bits to something that's much bigger, and I feel like SEO is on the cusp of making more and more of a positive impact for people's lives. So if we could pull back just from best practice and start thinking how even the smallest tests can affect the humans that we're trying to target, I think we'd be better off.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really
I'm a total mush.
No, that's good. It's good.
So are you saying that best practice makes you focus on tactics and not on strategies?
I think so, and I think you have to break some of those best practices in order to find something a little bit more human, because even though we're evolving as an industry and as individuals, so are the people out there and what they expect. So you have to stay very open-minded to that, and I think that as you isolate variables, you have a tendency to get very sterile, but really, people out there are becoming more and more aware. They have more options, and they're suckers for kindness. Like, actually showing that human element could go against best practices, but I've seen it do wonders for business.
Well, that's good. It's good business at the end of the day.
It's like
just
I
good
sleep
business.
well business, and that's, you know, it took me a while to get there, but I sleep better. So,
like an example of like SEO is good business that like helps humans have a better day is making sure that you're optimizing for post-conversion satisfaction queries. Someone just bought your product and they're unhappy with it. How much SEO have you done on that? It's good for the user because they're satisfied, they get answers quicker. It's good for the business because it cuts down on call center volume.
Yeah.
You know, so like this, yeah, that's maybe more of a business-minded example of that. But
like, we're getting all touchy-feely for next year.
Oh.
Come on,
You want
humans
to
are great.
do an audience question before? Okay.
Yeah, audience questions, guys? Yes.
I have a question about metrics to measure the impact of SEO experiments. There are many of them, page views, sessions, users, bounce rate. What do you use?
So our platform is based on organic sessions to the test groups, and with the understanding or the assumption that that's going to encapsulate any changes to click-through rate. We do, so there are obviously potential CRO or changes to conversions from an SEO experiment. We don't run our platform on conversion metrics. We just prefer to measure that stuff alongside or after the test has been run to look at those two variables separately. For us, it's organic sessions is kind of that all.
Yeah. So we normally use just sessions as a sort of starting point, but we have then balanced metrics. So we'll then look at on-site behavior to make sure that we haven't then caused something else to break, i.e. is it actually good traffic and are we delivering a good experience to those users is equally as important as making the number of users go up.
yeah, ultimately you want them to convert, right? So
Yeah, that's always good.
Yeah.
I like getting paid. So yeah, but you want to make sure that experience is correct, because just driving traffic to a page that offers no value to users is like, it's a spamming game. And I sleep better these days now that I don't spam. I didn't like that laugh there, but
this question's for Mike, but maybe some others have some input. With all the testing that you've done for clients and through ODN, have you noticed any latency that is not related to when the page gets crawled? So in other words, you know that the page has been crawled, you know the set of pages have been crawled, but the effects of the change don't happen until X days later, or is there any latency, or do you notice like the next day?
I'm afraid I'm not going to have a great answer for you on that. It's a good question for sure. We do see latency for most of our tests, like 2 to 4 weeks, but I'm not sure that we've ever actually looked at log data to confirm when that page was last crawled versus the latency of the test result. So it's a good question. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer.
I mean, rendering is going to play a part in that too, because when you have a site that needs to be rendered browser side instead of just server side, you're going to get it crawled first, but then the secondary bot's going to come and actually render it and then marry that data. And there can be a pretty big gap. Like supposedly it's supposed to be pretty quick from the first browser to the second rendering bot to come through, but that could also take weeks. I mean, Google hasn't said much about the time between that. So I think theoretically it should be pretty quick, but it's another reason why you want to use something like pre-render, because I think you could isolate that and get that out of it. Otherwise, I imagine that depending on the technology of the site, that's going to affect the latency question too.
You could test it.
You're really smart.
Someone could test it. All right, I know what I'm doing this weekend.
So it seems one of the important parts of conducting a research test or some kind of experiment is having a very controlled environment. And especially recently, it seems like we hear about almost daily algorithm updates coming out from Google. How have you kind of figured out how to control for what effects you're seeing as a result of algorithm changes versus actual changes that you've implemented as part of a test?
You don't. You just like do it again and again and again and again and again and again. And then over time, it smooths out, right? That's how you get that signal.
I mean, you're looking at differences in algorithms, data centers, locations, languages. Then you start going to the people that are using it, the time of day, where they're crawling from. Then you go to device, to operating system, to browser that they're using within that, or even its own closed browser like Facebook. Like, this is why we can't sleep well, and we decide to be nice to people to balance that out, because there's just too many goddamn
You know, in the same ways we went to chemistry class and you found if you took this and you added some acid to it, something happened, right? That's basically all we're trying to do with these tests is every time we do this, pretty much, do we get kind of the same result? And we have to think about it that way. That's what I find.
You have to approach it with like just extreme rigor, right? Like you even though you can't control the variables, you do have to enumerate the various variables that are outside of your control so that you have an awareness of them, so that when you're repeating, you're aware that you're at least hitting the iterations of those variables as much as you possibly can. Like that, there's a level of rigor that's required in order to do that kind of testing.
And you've probably had the best data on that, because you're grabbing CERT, publicly available data, where I've always worked with clients, and maybe I have access to 15,000 clients, but it's still a much smaller data set than you have access to, so bigger and better.
Simulating the conditions under which the query is being searched is the more challenging part probably there. It's just like different device types, different IP location, different weather in that country on that day, for example. I mean, anything,
Okay. Unfortunately, we have to cut it short because we went well over time. Oops. But I want to thank everyone for joining the panel and for all the great audience questions. We're going to be around later to drink and answer questions. Okay, good. All right, it's all good.
Thank you. I mean, emotionally, no.
All right, we have something very exciting planned now. For those of you who aren't aware, leading up to Tech Boost, we had a research competition that was spearheaded by Russ Jones. He's going to come tell you a little bit more about it, why we did it. We also have some of the finalists here. They're going to present their highlights from their research submissions, and then we're going to announce the winner. So very exciting stuff, and Russ, come on up. Woo.
All right. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to grab the words that came out of your mouth and pull them back in, but last year, right after the TechSEO conference, I was so excited about all of the conversations that I had had. Everybody talked either about research that they had been doing or about something interesting they had seen, and I thought to myself, if they would just go and test that and see if that really is true, it'd be fantastic. So in conversations with Paul and the others, I was like, we should We should have a call for papers. We should do this properly. We should have a formal research contest. Hell, I'll put $1,000. Oh, I should have pulled that back. But nevertheless, I'm still really excited about this today. I was also able to get Moz to help sponsor this research competition as well. We ended up with a little more than a dozen competitors with research across the board, from very small, minute types of things to really grandiose projects. And the hope is that we can continue this from year on out, and we'll get more and more applicants, and eventually this conference will be kind of the research hub for our industry. When I gave the State of Technical SEO talk last year, I really pushed that research is essential, and it comes from technical SEOs. And it's essential because if we don't do research, then the only thing we can do is wait for Google to tell us what to do. But if we do research, then we can find opportunities that exist and ultimately competitive advantages. Well, we have 3 finalists today. 2 of them are with us. One of them is international, so they can't be here. But they're on the board. First is going to be OVH, and then the Salt Agency and Proficient. We're going to start with Vincent Tarasi from OVH. They build a machine learning model capable of predicting SERPs. And if I'm correct, they have a nice
Hello
video
world,
for us to watch.
I am Vincent Terradi and I manage the data marketing teams at OVH. I am so excited and proud to be named as a finalist today, and I'm really glad I can share my works with the community. I firmly believe that all knowledge is interconnected to all other knowledge. The fun part is making the connections. And with data marketing, we can find new connections every day. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about OVH. We are a fast-growing cloud provider that delivers computing power and infrastructure to 1.3 million customers in 140 different countries, including the US, where we have just launched 2 data centers. We are Europe's largest server manufacturer, the first cloud provider to industrial water cooling, and a leader in the open cloud movement. Every year, all websites share the ranking criteria they consider most relevant from an SEO standpoint. That's what inspired my team and I to explore more focus on quantitative analysis. The solution that we reach involve using machine learning to identify the most relevant SEO factors for very specific search theme without the need for any human intervention. We combine several tools that usually work independently, that get as close as possible to Google ranking factor. That's the dream of SEO marketer, correct? We started with SEMrush to generate the top 100 URL for a list of more than 3,000 keywords, which became our initial dataset. We then enriched it using 4 additional pieces of software: Majestic for external criteria, OnCrawl or Screaming Frog for internal criteria, and last but not the least, Visiblis for semantic content. The XGBoost and random forest algorithms were applied to all our data to identify which factors will raise a web page up to the first page of Google. To maximize our efficiency, we combine all this with DataQ, a very cool data science platform that we use a lot. Now, the result is something of a game changer for us, SEO marketers. We are able to accurately determine a page change of ranking is the 10 top 10 Google result for relevant searches. We can define relevant patterns and variables for specific topics with an extremely high accuracy of 92%. Every time a new web page is created, our tool can tell whether it will rank in the first page of Google, all in real time. This project demonstrates that data science can be used to successfully predict URL positioning, which opens up some really exciting possibilities for SEO marketers. In fact, or discoveries have made all big generic rankings factor studies obsolete. Thank you all for watching me and for your great feedback so far. It's much appreciated. If you like to hear more, I can explain you the source code. I'm really hope you will vote for our Google Ranking Predictive Tools project. Thanks, Predictive SEO works.
All right, let's give him a round of applause. So the second contestant here is a finalist. Should be familiar from earlier this morning. I want to invite Dan Taylor back up onto the stage to talk about Cloudflare and service workers.
Yeah, hello again. I wasn't actually expecting to make the final, so that's why this is going to be fairly similar to last time. Thank you. So essentially on this one as well, I just want to actually mention that all of this wouldn't actually be fully possible for us if it wasn't for actually the developer behind who I've got doing this, which is Igor, who hopefully is still back in England watching this, or he's forgotten, I'm not. So essentially the hypothesis we had that came from the struggles of clients and also not only with hreflang but also implementing redirects on things like Git pages, which don't have a native functionality to do so, was to see whether or not we could actually leverage what was only being used for little basic things to actually be used as either stopgap solutions or permanent solutions for some sites where development queues, logistics, gatekeepers, all those other issues existed, and then, if successful, can it be done on scale and actually recognized by Google in multiple facets? So the methodology we actually did this with, so for redirects, we actually just did this on an actual live site migration from Git pages to WordPress. That was about 7 months ago now, and everything happened as it should. Redirects moved, pages moved, rankings moved. It was exactly like a normal site migration, although the redirects weren't server or client side, they was on the edge. And then the actual hreflang and all the testing, again, we just use real world example sites, and in this case, I tried to break my own site. Through our actual results, like I showed earlier, we can actually now do this at scale, and to turn those into generators and close the loop in that respect was quite easy. So that's why we released Sloth early this morning as well, and you can sign up to that and literally upload CSVs. It'll convert it into JavaScript code, so you don't even need to know JS to actually be able to do this. You just need to be able to copy and paste into a Cloudflare account. From this technology as well, we also found out we can do this through canonicals, we can do basic level A/B testing, we can even inject security headers as well. So if your client's still in Europe, obviously the GDPR, so there needs to be extra security parameters in place for data breaches and things like that. Then we actually have to weigh up the pros and cons. So obviously pros of this are it's a simple JavaScript, it's asynchronous code, it's lightweight. The latency that it adds, we found is less than half a millisecond. It's a simple API. Because it's copy and pasting Cloudflare, it's also one-click deployment, so it removes DevOps, and it's extremely straightforward and can be managed by a non-technical team. And again, there's next to zero DevOps with that as well, so it migrates that process. The only cons on this again is the caveats of everything we do in SEO. So there are potentials for impacts other things. This is why when we do this, it's important to still include developers in conversations to make sure that the JS is complementary and won't break things they're doing. And in some cases, depending on stacks, it can add latency, just depending on how other things in the head load, and again, the complementary aspects to it. And with anything that happens with development, any code push can introduce any kind of bug. So it's important to monitor, test, and keep validating. So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I want to reiterate how exciting some of this research really is. I mean, now between ODN and Rank Science and Cloudflare service workers, we now have many different methodologies to perform research. I kind of liked this one because it was research to prove that you could do research using Cloudflare. The last to come up is a name well known in the industry, Eric Enga with Proficient. I'd like to invite him up for his study on Do Links Still Matter?
You too. Okay. Perfect. So yes, I want to talk about whether links still matter, not just for 2017 like the original slide said, but since we're in 2018, maybe we'll talk about 2018 too. The debate has been out there, and what causes it is as Google does more and more changes to the way that they evaluate relevance on a site, more and more people will write articles that look like this one asking about whether links still really matter. And what's going on there is that people are conflating this change in way relevance is evaluated with whether or not links are still a ranking factor. They're very different things. It's been a long time since you could get a Tupperware site to rank for a used car query. By the way, you used to be able to do that long ago in SEO, but you can't do that today. So the other thing as background for this is that we used to have great studies from Moz and Searchmetrics, and there was so much criticism out there in the industry about correlation studies because correlation not equals causation, that whole conversation. But to our point of view, they still really matter. And so as we thought about, well, okay, we think links still matter a great deal, we decided to set out and do our own correlation studies, which we've been maintaining over a few years now, to show whether or not they still matter and evaluate how that changes over time. So a little bit about the methodology. So that's a quadratic mean calculation, but let me give you a little background. We decided to challenge the original approach to the math that people are using, and to do that, we brought in Paul Berger, the director of analytics from Bentley University, and Per Enga, actually that is my brother, from Stanford University, both experts in statistics, to help us evaluate the approach. And most correlation studies use a factor called R, that's the correlation value, but it turns out that that literally has no meaning at all in statistics. So instead, what we were advised to do was use a value called R squared. And R squared allows you to make a statement that the correlation value tells you the percent chance that the value X explains what's going on in Y. So there's a direct actual assessment of impact when you use R squared. So we used this revised math, and basically in the first 2 years of our study, August 2016 and May 2017, these are the values we saw. We went from 0.303 to 0.325 in terms of the level of correlation seen. The value actually went up slightly, but that's probably within normal range of error. Now, it turns out just yesterday I got the not yet published 2018 value for this, which is now based on a slightly larger data set using Moz's Link Explorer. Gave a value of 0.293, so pretty much the same story going on. The other interesting thing about this is for the first time, the DA of the linking site correlation to the rank was stronger than a simple count of links to the ranking page. So that's something that appears to have crept into the world as a result of Link Explorer being released. So last thing we did is that we said, okay, we have a very complex environment here. We're dealing with over 200 ranking factors. Of course, we're going to have many search results where the correlation is extremely low. That's just a natural part of the environment, right? So what if we did this? What if we took and we normalized the link counts for each ranking factor? So the link counts for everything was between 0 and 1. And the reason to do this was to prevent very popular queries where link counts would be very high from skewing the evaluation of less popular queries where the link counts were very low. And we summed all those, and we did a quadratic mean calculation on that. And so the purpose of this, again, was just to take out the noise and get more of an aggregate assessment as to how much links might weigh in the overall environment as a ranking factor. Here the values are basically off the charts and all very extremely high, and it doesn't matter whether you're using a Pearson correlation or a Spearman correlation. The values are still very high here in the 2018 study too, actually slightly higher than these. So What this all suggests to me in the end that links are still very much a ranking factor. They're still very potent. Yes, there are a lot of other things that are impacting rankings today. That doesn't mean that this factor has been lost. But let's try to back up into some intuition for this. Why do they matter? Imagine you have a retail store and someone comes in and the first thing you say to them is, by the way, there's a sale at so-and-so across town. You might want to check it out. They might leave. And that's exactly what you're inviting people to do when you implement a link on your site. So if you haven't been paid for it or compensated for it, the only reason you have for implementing a link is because you think there's enough value to your visitor, to your user on your page, that you're willing to take the risk that they're actually going to leave. That's a fundamental core part of why this still matters. And hopefully, our study has helped show, at least from a correlation and math point of view, that the data says it still matters too. Thank you.
All right, and I want to reiterate here something that's really fantastic about this study, and one of the reasons why I think that it made it into the finalists is that it has been a multi-year process. As mentioned in the previous panel, things are constantly changing with Google, which means that we need to check ourselves over and over and over again to make sure that those best practices really are continually to be true. There's one thing I did want to say, well, actually two things while I'm on stage. The first thing is just that I have every intent, if the team is willing, to do this again next year, and if so, I want as many of you to participate as you possibly can. There we go. The study does not need to be huge. In fact, some of the most interesting things that came out were very minuscule, and frankly, as a former SEO at an agency, those little nuggets of information that produced, I am certain are making those companies tons of money right now because of the research that they had done. The other thing I wanted to do was to thank all of our judges. So we actually assembled a panel of reputable individuals across the industry. Ruth Barreedy, Rhea Drysdale, Alexis Sanders, myself, Jeff Kenyon. Most of y'all don't know, but Neil Martinson-Burrell is the head data scientist at Moz, so we kind of checked to make sure that the numbers were really accurate. Aleda Solis and Clark Boyd. And without that, with no further ado, I'm going to try to not la-la land this thing. I'm going to get to announce the winner. So I'm pretty excited about this. Did you really lick this thing? This is going to take a second. Let the suspense build. Yeah, absolutely. All right. And the winner is going to be Dan Taylor, Search Consultant Technical Account Director at Salt Agency, for their work with cloud service workers. Congratulations. All right, and yeah, we got one of these. We did it.
We went for it.
Yeah. You want to come stand over here and hold it up so that it
I had one
gets...
goal in mind, was to hold a big...
Yeah, do I get to touch it? I want to touch it. Part of this is mine. All right, so I want to thank everybody who participated in this. I think we have another session coming up, but we are really excited about the research this community continues to produce, and hopefully next year we'll be able to field a lot more papers and see all the great work that you're doing. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Exciting stuff. Well, there we go. Winner is Salt. So obviously, Dan's going to have a few things to celebrate. Just a reminder that coming up in just a little bit, we're going to have the Botify cocktail hour that will be outside where everyone enjoyed lunch today. So drinks are coming up very, very soon. But before that, we have one final presentation. It's our afternoon keynote. I'm going to invite Tim Kadlec up to the stage, and he's going to give a session on web performance.
Thanks. This one, yeah, that's good. Yeah, so I talked to the Botify folks. I think the incentive here is that if you manage to stick through this entire talk, that's how you get access to the happy hour. I haven't gotten final confirmation, but that's what I'm angling for. But before I start, though, I wanted to say, can we get a round of applause for Megan and Paul and the entire Catalyst team, because this has been fantastic. I have been so thoroughly impressed by the quality of the content, just the atmosphere. It's a very friendly, engaging area. It's been great. I'm a web performance consultant, so I do a lot of talks at web conferences, like web development, web design, performance, stuff like that. This is actually my first technical SEO event. It's my first SEO event, period. And I wasn't sure what to expect, but it really has been fantastic. And it's been amazing, and it's been great and wonderful and stellar and super and outstanding. Is that enough? That's enough keywords, right? I'm so sorry. I will say, I couldn't resist it. I will say for you to have some fire back at me. As a performance consultant, I get a lot of grief as well. I gave a talk at a company in Canada, and afterwards the development team was kind enough to gift me with this poster that is now posted on my office wall. So yeah, I feel a lot of the same pain. It's fine. No, but I actually think that it's interesting because I think, like, from an outsider perspective, I think SEO, and particularly the technical SEO side of things, has a really kind of pure and noble goal about it. My perspective is the goal of search engines, the goal of search engine optimization, is to help connect people with the information that they need in the highest quality source. And I think that's a pretty pure, ambitious goal. Like, that's a pretty noble endeavor to be undertaking. And particularly what interests me is that high quality source part of it. Search engines have gotten a lot more opinionated now about what constitutes a relevant and quality source of information. We've come a long way from stuff that Frederick and Christy were talking about from 1957. It's nowhere near that, right? Like, we have everything factored in now, not just the content itself, but how that content is structured. We factor in how well that stuff is packaged up. Like, what is the design? Is it mobile friendly? Is it performant? All of these things kind of come into play. Performance in particular this year has been a hot topic of discussion. I've actually had several people that I've worked with this year that came specifically because an SEO consultant told them, hey, you need to improve the performance of your site, so thank you for that. It's also why I was very happy. I was a little nervous when the panel was up and somebody asked if, like, people from SEO were getting a little out of bounds with the performance stuff, and I was like, no, no, please. So I was happy to hear everybody kind of agreeing that this is right in the right wheelhouse. You know, this is nothing new. Like, 2010, I think, is when Google launched or first wrote about performance being in the search rankings in some way or another. At the time, it was desktop only, at least allegedly. Somewhat ironically, given that mobile performance can be so terrible, but that's where they started. But what kind of jumped it this year was at the beginning of the year, they talked about their speed update. And then in July, that rolled out, where finally, officially, performance is a part of the ranking consideration from a mobile perspective as well. And so this is what really has been drawing the attention to performance this year from an SEO perspective. We don't know what that metric is, though, that they're looking at. We don't know much about how they're using it. We know that it factors in. We don't know what what metric they're looking at. It could be anything. We don't know. You know, even the weight it carries. Like, is it a tiebreaker? Are there situations where it's more important than others? Like, is it more important on a mobile search than a desktop search? If they can detect that the network is slow, does that make performance a bigger part of the algorithm? All of that's kind of speculation. The only thing we really have is from, like, 2013 when Moz paired up with Zoomf to do a study on page performance, trying to find which metric had the highest correlation to search engine ranking. Now, to be clear, the conclusion of this isn't that the metric that they found is the one that Google was using. That's not what they were going for. They're just trying to find, again, that correlation to sort of get a hint. Interestingly, the metric that they discovered was time to first byte, which is probably the least likely candidate, in my opinion. Like, if anybody's not familiar, time to first byte measures the time from when I enter in the URL to when I get that first byte of content back from the server. That's it. It doesn't tell me anything about when the page displays, when the page becomes usable. It doesn't even tell me if I've got the entire HTML. All it tells me is I've got that first little itty-bitty chunk of it. It's a good metric for things like telling you that your server's running slow and you probably have some caching issues or you have CDN issues. But that's the extent of it. So consider, for example, the Boston Globe. Time to first byte on Boston Globe on a 3G network is 341 milliseconds. This is what the site looks like at 341 milliseconds in the loading process. There's not much there. Anybody feel confident from this single data point telling us if the Boston Globe performs well or not? Probably not. It doesn't give you a lot from a user perspective. It doesn't give you much information. So as an industry, we've sort of started to shift from this in the performance community. We keep tabs on it, and we keep tabs on load time, but they're not the primary metrics anymore. We're much more focused on metrics that matter to the user and answer questions that they have. So for example, once I type in a URL, when do I get some sort of signal that something's happening? So for that, we look at something like start render. On the Boston Globe, that's about 5.7 seconds. That's the point at which something appears on the screen. When is that stuff meaningful? When is it meaningful content? Now, Boston Globe has the exact same meaningful time as their initial render. 5.7 seconds is meaningful content. In some situations, your start render is like a background image or a background color, and that's not particularly meaningful. So you end up with a gap between start render and meaningful paint. But so is it happening? Is it meaningful? And when can I actually use the thing? Like, when is the page interactive? For Boston Globe, that ended up being about 33 seconds on a 3G connection. This is because we have a lot of stuff, and Crufton will talk about some of those things coming in, like third-party scripts and other things that slow it down. But this is the first point in the page load process where if I click on something, the browser is free and the browser's just kind of waiting because it's too busy with everything else. These are much more meaningful metrics. And if you want to keep tabs on these, and I feel like you should, I know they've got the accessibility audits and SEO audits and a whole bunch of other things baked in as well. It's just a good thing to have running consistently and monitoring. But they'll report each of these metrics for you, so you can kind of keep tabs on how you're doing. But these are much more meaningful, much more impactful metrics. They're also notably the metrics that all the browser teams are pushing. Like Google Chrome team is very vocal about this. The Edge team is very vocal about this. The Firefox team is very vocal about this. The app team is pretty vocal about these metrics. Now, I'm not necessarily, I don't want to insinuate that the search engine team and the Chrome team, for example, are in cahoots here and they're pushing the metrics that the search engine team is also going to be focusing on. But I do think it's a signal that you can at least be kind of paying attention to. And if I was a betting man, which I'm not, but if I was a betting man, I would say that if they are not using signals like this right now, it's going to be happening in the near future. You know, again, search engines' goal with including performance is to make sure that they're ensuring a better experience for users when they click through. So it makes sense for them to focus on those user-focused metrics. You know, we may never get the answer, and I hope that we do not, to be honest with you, because as soon as you start optimizing for an individual metric, the rest of the metrics kind of get pushed to the side. That's why it's usually good to have several metrics that you're looking at so that you're not, you know, neglecting some of them in the process. There is no one metric to rule them all, especially when it comes to performance. It's like trying to measure how fast you're running a marathon by taking your 5-mile marker and extrapolating the data based on that. Like, you can't do it. It's a journey, and to measure a journey, you have to measure multiple stops along the way. You also don't just make performance faster for the sake of making things faster. That's not why we do things. We do it because we know that there's a business value. This is a chart from SpeedCurve, which is a great performance monitoring company, with a client that I worked on earlier this year. And what it's showing you is the bounce rate as it relates to start render time. So the start render time is here in the blue, and you can see that as the start render time gets higher and higher, that pink line, that bounce rate, continues to go through the roof. There's a direct connection here between how quickly we get stuff on the screen and whether or not those people are going to stick around. And this is far from an isolated incident. Tammy Everett and I maintain a site called WPOstats.com where we collect every case study we've ever seen that ties performance to some sort of a key business metric. And there are pages and pages of these things here. And in fact, if you're ever working with someone or ever find your own stuff, particularly as it relates to SEO traffic kind of stuff, because we love that kind of thing, you're free to submit stuff on through GitHub and we pull it right in. But we've seen it impact every single major metric we can think of. You know, everything from bounce rate. Etsy saw a 12% increase in bounce rate just by including 160K of images on their mobile site. To engagement. This woman found that they had conversion jump of 50% by improving their load time. Tokopedia talked about how they reduced their start render time, and when they did, they saw engagement metrics across the board improve. And then, yes, traffic. Pinterest rebuilt their pages for traffic and saw a 15% increase in SEO traffic. And they're not isolated. They're not the only example that we have from this either. We've seen a direct relationship. This is why we make things faster. This is why search engines, again, search engines don't prioritize performance for the sake of doing it. We don't make things faster for the sake of making them faster. We make things more performant because better performance means a better experience, and that means better revenue, better conversions, better engagement. So this means that we have a little bit of a challenge, though, because the web as we've built it, and I say we kind of collectively, not just us in this room, but developers, designers, everybody involved in it, is a bit heavy. Over the last 3 years, if you look at data from HTTP Archive, which monitors all sorts of information across 1.3 million different sites, you'll see that the median page weight has jumped by 15% on desktop and almost 50% on mobile. It's a huge jump. And does anybody want to take a guess? We've sort of alluded to it probably half a dozen times already today. Anybody want to take a guess which resource might be driving a lot of that growth? JavaScript. Yeah, JavaScript has been mentioned so many times in passing today, and always with like the rightful trepidation. Yeah, JavaScript is pushing a lot of this growth. As developers are sort of latching onto these client-side frameworks, things like React and Angular and Vue and Ember, you know, and these are fantastic from a developer ergonomic perspective. They're great. I mean, as a developer working with these, they're very friendly. It's very easy to build out some really complex, rich, immersive experiences with them. But the cost is that we're putting more and more JavaScript onto the device. So over that same 3-year span, JavaScript has increased by 55% on the median on desktop and a whopping 73% on mobile. We are using a lot of script to power these pages. And JavaScript introduces a big bottleneck both for search engines as well as for the browser itself. So from a search engine perspective, we talk about like the crawl, process, index, you know, sort of approach, right? And it's always been pretty straightforward. Like you do the crawl, you do some processing, you index a few things, you queue up a few more things for crawling. It's not bad. And if it's HTML content, this is still what it is. That's your first pass. It works great. Google's been very vocal this year about how much more involved this the process step has gotten. Now they actually have to go through a whole rendering process inside of here. So you get that initial pass, and if your content's there, it's good. But then the second pass, what they have to do is they have to actually add these URLs to a renderer queue, and then take those URLs and one by one, probably not one by one, they probably have multiple servers, but you get the point. They start to pull things out of the queue, pass it to the renderer, which is basically a headless version of Chrome, running like 41, really old version. They should probably update that. And pass it through Chrome 41, and then that's your output. Like once they run the JavaScript, now they can actually look and index some of that content that's coming from those JavaScript-heavy pages. Bing has a very similar solution. The terminology is a little different, but they have like a crawl queue, and their renderer is based on Edge. But it's similar, right? You have to fire it up in the browser to render, to actually execute the JavaScript and render some content out so it's usable. Now, Bing and Google have done a lot of amazing work to make this process as fast as possible. In fact, Frederick, I think, has given a talk about all the work that went in from the Bing side of things to speed this process up. However, they do have the deck stacked against them a little bit. It turns out that there's, you know, a few like 100 trillion different URLs online, and it takes time to process that many URLs. And so it takes a while to go through the queue. So at Google I/O, it kind of there was a little bit of waves coming out of this, at least in the circles that I follow, when they revealed on stage that in their situation, it can take as long as a week for your URL to get through that queue. So if you've got a JavaScript-heavy page, yeah, Google can run some JavaScript. Bing can run some JavaScript. You can get those things indexed, but it might take a while before that happens. In the meantime, you've got new pages or new content or changes that's kind of just sitting there languishing. So there's a big bottleneck from search engine perspective. There's a big bottleneck from the browser perspective as well. When a browser finds JavaScript, it stops everything. So when it's coming along and it sees that you're using jQuery Acular, which is probably in production somewhere, a combination of these 3 libraries, what happens is the browser says, hold on, JavaScript can change the DOM, JavaScript can change the styles. I need to stop everything. I need to download the JavaScript. I need to parse it. I need to compile it, figure out what I'm going to do, execute it, and then I'll continue on parsing the rest of the page. So it is a huge bottleneck in the display of the page. Now, we can help it a little bit by giving it a few hints, and it's actually much easier than it used to be. It used to be you had to use some complex JavaScript to load all these things and handle it. Now, more or less, it's a little bit more straightforward. We have the async and defer attributes. So what async does is async says we're going to move the downloading part in parallel. So when the browser finds a script with an async attribute, it's going to go ahead and download that JavaScript while continuing to parse the rest of the HTML. And then only once that JavaScript's downloaded, we don't know when that's going to be, but once it's downloaded, it'll stop what it's doing, execute the JavaScript, and move on. So at least we move some of that in parallel and reduce the bottleneck a little bit. Defer is even better. Defer is sort of the nuclear option. With defer, what we're saying is defer the execution until everything else is done. So when it finds the script element, it doesn't stop. It just keeps going, parsing the HTML, downloading the JavaScript in the background. Once that HTML has all been parsed and we have an opportunity to actually get something on the screen, that's when we're going to execute the JavaScript. So defer and async can push a lot of this bottleneck stuff out of the way and get things out onto the screen much quicker. They also have the added advantage of making the page interactive a little bit earlier, like reducing the amount of work the browser has to do on the main thread. Browsers operate with this concept of threads. It's similar to like a department store, right? Think of a checkout line at a department store. Imagine, this is the worst designed department store ever. Imagine that they have one line that handles all the checkouts, the returns, it handles the customer service. You're all queuing up in the same queue, right? And it's not, if you've got like one thing you want to return, we've all been in that situation. You get one thing you want to return, and the person in front of you is like buying like $600, $700 worth of Legos or something, and it's slowing down the entire checkout process. They want to help you, and they will eventually get to you, but they have to take care of the rest of it first. This is how it works with like the main thread of the browser. The main thread of the browser is responsible for JavaScript execution. It's responsible for anything that the user does, responding to that. It's responsible for anything related to layout or painting. Anything like that happens on that main thread. So if we've got a lot of JavaScript running, it means if a user comes along and tries to interact with the page, the browser's it can't do anything until it's done with what it's trying to do. When we use async and defer, what we do is we tell the browser it's OK to put that on a separate thread. So just like a department store opens up multiple different lines for you so that you can kind of move through a little bit faster at least, the browser will try to open up multiple different threads. Now, it still has one main thread, right? Like at the end of the day, the user input, the layout, and the actual execution of the script all has to happen on this main thread. It's sort of the conductor of the entire experience. But with async and defer, we tell it it's OK to do the parsing and everything separately. Like, get that out of the way so that people can still interact with the page. And then only when you're ready to run it, then move it onto the main thread. So it speeds that up as well. Async and defer actually also protects against some fragility introduced by a single point of failure, which I think is one of those performance topics that just never, I don't know, it's just never seemed to get as much attention as it should. Single point of failure is a situation where you're using a third-party resource, and the third-party domain that you're loading it from has issues. Like their site suffers, they've got some server issues, IP issues, something that is causing them to be slow to respond. And because of that, because of the blocking nature of JavaScript, when they suffer, you suffer as well. It's a pretty common situation, and it can impact both the browser experience as well as the search engine indexing experience. Catchpoint just wrote a blog post about something they saw on Black Friday. We're probably the worst time for a third-party provider to ever go down if you're an e-com company, right? But they found out, they were looking at some data, and what they saw was that Core Metrics, which is a really popular service used by e-com sites, had a little bit of issues. You can see here's a chart of the response time to the data.coremetrics.com site. Right? So things are going well here until around 9:15. All of a sudden, you see the response time from that domain spikes. We're talking up to 30 seconds to get a response from the domain. If you look at the chart for the performance of the sites using that same script, it matches up. Once they get to that same spike, because Core Metrics was coming in late and because Core Metrics was being loaded in a blocking way, we have page load times that are jumping up to 35 seconds. And it's all because of their dependency on that one third party. And if that third party is async or defer, you don't have that issue. But instead, we've stopped the parsing of everything and waited 30 seconds for Core Metrics to come through. And I'm not picking on Core Metrics. Like, this is not just them. This is the reality of the web. Things are going to break. Your third-party services are going to have outages. They're going to have issues. At some point or another, this will happen. It's also a geography thing. Single point of failure is a huge thing if you're trying to reach any sort of a global audience, particularly somewhere in China. With the whole Great Firewall of China, like SPOFs are extremely common in that kind of situation. So async and defer are deceptively simple. They're just 5 characters, 1, 2, 3, yeah, 5 characters each, but they can actually be extremely impactful from a performance perspective and a usability perspective. Now this helps with when the execution happens, but you still have to deal with the fact that we have a lot of execution and a lot of script to deal with. We were talking about that 457 for the median for desktop. That's the compressed small version. When we send text resources over the network, we package it up in a nice tidy bundle and just compress it really tight. And when it gets down to the browser has to unpack it and deal with all that raw text. So what this means is that, yeah, we're sending 457K over the network. When the browser gets that JavaScript, that's anywhere between 2,500 to 3,000 kilobytes of JavaScript code that it has to run through, parse, compile, and then eventually execute. I just want to put this in perspective. Anybody play Doom? OK, Doom, the entire code base, 2,300 kilobytes. So we are sending more JavaScript to power a single web page than was needed for the entire code base to create what is pretty much a classic epic video game. I think we can all agree. So I just wanted to put that in perspective. Now, I don't want to make it all sound gloom and doom. I'm so sorry. I amuse myself. Yeah, I know, I'm bad. This is why my wife never hangs out with me in public. It's the dad joke thing. However, the parse and compile time for this can be very significant as well. Adi Ismani from Google fired up a bunch of tests trying to see for like 1 megabyte, so less than what we're loading at the median. How long does it take to just do the parse part? Ignore the execution, just for the browser to figure out what it's going to do across a bunch of different devices. And these are the results. You see at the top, the MacBook Pro is not too bad. But as you start to get into that long tail of devices, those mid to low-end Android devices, which, by the way, are what are powering the growth of the web right now, then you're jumping into the 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 milliseconds to parse 1 megabyte. So when we're passing potentially 3,000 kilobytes down, we're talking just from a parsing cost, like 9, 10 seconds, 11 seconds is not atypical to run across. So there's a significant cost associated with all this JavaScript. And one of the most important things we can do is send a lot less down. One of the great tools for identifying this and seeing if you have code, because there's usually a lot of excess code that isn't being used that's being sent down to the device, is to fire up the Chrome DevTools. I know Sean mentioned like keeping them open just to make yourself look productive. I'm one of those weirdos who have it open anyway. Like I literally do browse all day with this open. But inside there's this fantastic code coverage tool. And what this will do is it'll load the page and track all the code that's being used and not used for every single JavaScript and CSS file. So you can zero in and see, all right, cool, on this particular JavaScript file, 80% of that code isn't being used during the page load process. Even better, you can pull it up inside the source panel, and it will actually highlight the blocks of the code that is not being used on the page. So you can go through this and very quickly identify entire functions, entire plugins, entire frameworks that maybe are there from a legacy perspective, or maybe like are used on certain pages but not on others. And you can start to strip those things out and reduce the amount of JavaScript. It's a really, it can be a very impactful process. I did this recently for an e-com site, and in about 2 hours, we had cut 1.5 megabytes of JavaScript out and reduced their time to interactive by like 40%. So you can make some really big gains just from this little optimization here. Again, going back to Dan's research, I did not know he was going to win the research thing, so that's kind of a nice little plug-in. But I was going to, like, offloading this JavaScript altogether from the device. Like, I've been picking on JavaScript a lot. I actually really like JavaScript. I just think we use too much of it, and we use it at the wrong place. We put it all on the browser, on the device, which is the most fragile and the least predictable part of the entire stack. Instead, what we can do is we can start to offload some of that stuff to the server. We can run with the node services in the background, but increasingly to the edge as well on the CDN. For a good example, to sort of add on to Dan's example already, client-side A/B testing, right, is the bane of every performance consultant's existence. It is, you're injecting a script in the page that is going to block the display of the page from a third-party service until it is done manipulating. That we've talked so testing. Thankfully, you can kind of start to break away from that. Optimizely, other solutions have server-side solutions. There's also been experimentation pulling this into Cloudflare workers. So Filament Group, which is here in Boston, well, they used to be here in Boston. I think now they're distributed, though. Some of them remain. They had been doing a lot of experimentation, and they just finally wrote this up a few days ago around putting these A/B tests inside of a Cloudflare worker. And so they built a script. It's available on GitHub. Everything Filament Group does, they put it on GitHub because they're amazing like that. That lets you have this service Cloudflare worker, and it'll parse your HTML on the CDN level. What that looks like from the HTML perspective is simply comments. You're highlighting a section. In this case, what we're defining is my test, and we have our A and our B within these comments. Then the Cloudflare worker kicks in. It finds the A or the B, siphons it off, and takes the other markup out, and passes that down. So you never end up with the sort of the blocking nature that the client-side stuff works in. You have a very fine-tuned A/B thing, and it's also fairly easy for developers to play with. You wrap a nice GUI on this, it also becomes easier for other folks inside the organization to play with as well. Moving JavaScript off the client is extremely impactful. In fact, moving JavaScript off the client is at the heart of most of the performance improvements that you see whenever you use Google or AMP. It's not Google AMP technically anymore, AMP project. AMP came out with all this to-do about how it was going to make the web money. I had from the in a version built in AMP that is served on the AMP CDN to see what the difference was in performance. And I loaded these up on web page tests through an automated process. And some of the results were pretty interesting. So first off, from a start render perspective, which we talked about as our first clue that something's happening, the canonical version actually beats the AMP version until you put the AMP on the CDN. And we're going to come back to that in a second. So that's the start render perspective. If you look at something like speed index, which is a metric that tries to determine how quickly the page loads, like the majority of the page is painted onto your screen, then AMP beats out canonical. And then again, the CDN gets a huge boost. There were more metrics I looked at, but even from these two, there were like a few interesting questions I thought that popped into mind. First, why is AMP faster? Like, what are they doing that makes them faster in the first place? Why is it slower at the start render? And then why does that get fixed as soon as you start using Google's AMP CDN? So first off, why is AMP faster? You don't have to look very far. Now, AMP is doing some really clever optimizations, some great work, but it's sort of the 80-20 rule here. Like 80% of the game comes from a very obvious place. If you look at those same 50 URLs and you look at the result in terms of the number of requests, the canonical non-AMP version was making on median 318 requests compared to 60 for the AMP version. AMP has a whole set of restrictions around what you can and cannot include in an AMP document. It is possible to shoot yourself in the foot and load a ton of stuff, but they make it much, much harder to do. So from an AMP perspective versus canonical, the AMP ends up with a lot less requests typically. To put this in a little bit more visual perspective, here's a waterfall. This is sort of the heart of all performance thing is a waterfall. If anybody's not seen it, it's showing you every resource that is requested by the page and when it comes in. This is the waterfall for the AMP version of a page. Okay, there's 23 resources on this particular waterfall. This is the waterfall for the non-AMP version of the exact same page with no display differences other than the fact that we have all those third-party stuff coming in. Actually, hold on 1 second, that cut off. Let me just... Is this right? We got time, right? It's good. There we go. That's the waterfall for the non-AMP version. And again, visually, there's no difference other than the fact that you have some ads and some like different ad providers and stuff like that. But you jump from 23 requests to 716 requests. You do not have to be a performance consultant or performance engineer to be able to tell that something with 23 resources being loaded is going to be significantly faster than something with 716. You also don't need AMP to necessarily enforce that for you. Now, this is an excessive example. The median thing that we're seeing on the web, if you look through HTTP archive data, is about 59% on any given page is going to be third-party resources versus first-party. That's a number I'd like to see go down. We get a lot of value from these third-party sources, But usually what happens is a lot of times we inject this stuff because we can, and then we don't think about whether or not we're actually using the data. Fixing this is not a technical thing. Fixing this is just sitting down with your marketing team, your other units, and saying, all right, cool, these are the services we're using right now on our page. When's the last time we logged into this one? You know, why do we have 3 different analytics services being called on this? Like making sure that you got real business reason that's driving why these things exist on your page and reducing it can go a long way towards improving performance. So again, AMP does a lot of smart things. This is at the heart of the biggest performance improvement. Why is it slower to start render? Because of this. AMP is very dependent on JavaScript initially to create everything. You don't make an image, you make an AMP image. You don't make a video, you make an AMP video. And it needs custom JavaScript for all of this stuff. And yes, it's asynchronous, but remember, async means that we still have to stop parsing the HTML to execute scripts. So we pause, execute, but then we got another script to execute, another, and another, and another. And so it delays that start render. But it speeds up on the CDN. If you look at what the CDN does, the CDN has a whole series of optimizations it applies. Good stuff that we should be applying anywhere. You can get this from any CDN in a build process, things like restricting your image sizes using HTTP2, injecting some resource hints. But it's the last one that does this. They pre-render the page on the AMP server. They take that JavaScript, pre-render it, and spit out the generated components instead. This is the same thing you heard from search engines with the dynamic rendering and how that can help you, except we're giving that benefit to everyone, not just the user. And again, all of these things you can do without AMP. So for me, AMP is less about a performance decision as it is a business decision. And from a business perspective, we've seen interesting results. We've seen some really good results. We've also seen a few results that were not so good. So you should just be fairly tested. I mean, we've been very data-driven and test-driven this entire day, so I don't think this is a problem. But when you put that out there, make sure you're testing and making sure you're getting the impact you want. You also keep in mind that Google is the primary backer of AMP. It is arguably not a Google project anymore. And in fact, it's a great sign that 25% of the contributors are from Google and the majority are not. However, keep in mind that as of February, 90% of the code is coming from Googlers and 10% is not. I'm not saying this to pick on Google. I just think this is something to keep in mind because in my mind, if we're ever on the fence about what to use, I'm going to bank on the web. And the web's already consuming it. It's taking the best things from AMP, turning them into standards so that you can get things like web packaging, which will let you get your content up in that search carousel that Google loves to tout for the AMP results. Feature policy, which will let you restrict the kind of content that's included on a page. So search engines can use this as some sort of indicator for some reliable means of performance. So if you should use AMP or not comes down to kind of your situation. Not necessarily the performance side of things, but are you willing to maintain 2 versions of your site, and or are you willing to commit to AMP altogether by itself? And if you are, how confident are you sticking around? I'm pretty confident saying the web will be here in 5 years and search engines are going to be indexing it. I can't say with the same degree of confidence that the framework of AMP will be around 5 years from now. When in doubt, bet on the web, which is why I'm more excited about progressive web apps, which is just a fancy way of saying a website with best practices built into it. It gets lumped up with the AMP conversation a lot because I think one of the people involved was a Chrome thing, so it's sort of associated with Google. It's not, though. It's just build a website, make sure it's responsive, make sure it's secure, make sure it's performant, make sure you're doing all of these nice best practices that are very user-focused. And if you do, you got yourself a progressive web app. And where we've seen up and down results of AMP, we've seen amazing results from progressive web apps in terms of what the return is on traffic, on engagement, on revenue, on conversions. We've seen great business impact, and I don't think that's any coincidence. It's powered by the web, directly by the web, and it's very user-focused. And remember, that is our goal. It is to build a better quality experience for our users, for people coming into our sites. It's so easy for everybody, not just developers, not just designers, not just technical SEO people, everybody who's touching it, everybody who's working in technology, it's very easy to forget that what we do is ultimately impacting the lives of real everyday people on the other end. And if we focus on those people and focus on making the improvements that matter to them, that are meaningful to them, we'll cut through the cruft and be able to figure out what optimizations and what improvements actually matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Oh, should we head up? Well, that's a wrap. Crazy.
Yeah, I'm sad now, but I'm sad. But the night's over, or is it just beginning?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes.
Yes.
But before we sort of transition to the next part of the evening, I again just want to thank all of our sponsors. Amazing partners. Thank you for Spotify for being our headline sponsor, Nozzle for being our lunch sponsor, Moz for sponsoring the research competition, Salt sponsored our live stream. You were able to broadcast today to over 50 countries globally, thanks to Salt. Ahrefs for the great hoodies. Rank Science sponsored breakfast this morning. I know a lot of the folks here right now maybe came after breakfast, but thanks to Rank Science, we got to start the day off on the right foot with a delicious meal. Thank you to Stat for sponsoring our coffee station, keeping everyone caffeinated throughout this day. Thanks to Deep Crawl for the great networking reception last night. It was a great way to start off the conference. And thank you to Conductor, who will be treating us to a lovely after party. And thank you to all of our speakers.
Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad. No. Want to go out of my way to give an extra thank you to Megan, who, without her, none of this would have been possible. Thank you. Thank you to. Thank you, Beth. No, well, we don't talk about me. All right, no. All right. I want to also thank Beth, Catalyst, Carrie, the rest of the Catalyst team that have been so helpful, making sure that this event ran smoothly. And thanks to all the attendees, because y'all showed up. And if not for you, this wouldn't be a thing. So, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And drinks are out that way.
Thanks, Spotify.